Good morning and welcome here in Brussels. As you could see, we decided to start a little bit later because of the specific situation here in Brussels, but I think now most of us have arrived and it's a good moment to start. So welcome again to this seminar on state aid in energy projects, linked to the management of the funds. My name is Pascal Boymans. I'm a head of unit in DG Regional Policy, of a unit which is called Competence Center for Administrative Capacity Building. And our interest is to help member states in implementing their operational programs and projects co-financed by the structural funds. And we work in different areas like public procurement, but also on state aid. So why are we organizing this seminar together with our colleagues in DG Competition? Well, first of all, to let you know, we are here with a group of people, all of you working in the management of the structural funds. And that's also the angle from which we start. Most of you are not direct state aid specialists, but you are working on state aid and also on energy projects. And you're here with representatives from 22 member states. And just to explain why we are organizing this event, and it's not a standalone event, it's part of a wider initiative we are doing. First of all, we observe from the side of the management of the structural funds that state aid has a very large impact on the management of the funds. And is also, unfortunately, one of the major sources of irregularities. So we have to apply sometimes financial corrections linked to because projects are not in compliance with the state aid rules. Our colleagues in DG Competition launched the modernization of the state aid package in 2014, and it offers a lot of new opportunities and also chances to modernize state aid rules also in the member states, but it also requires at the same time a lot of know-how and expertise to apply the rules correctly. And with that in mind, we have developed together, DG Regional Policy and DG Competition, a common action plan, how we can improve the know-how and the expertise in this area for those colleagues who are managing operational programs and projects. So we have joined our forces and we have set up a range of different activities. For example, last year we organized conferences on state aid in those member states which didn't fulfill the ex-ante conditionality on state aid. So we had seminars in Croatia, in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania and Bulgaria. Besides that, we will also start organizing more trainings, two-day trainings on state aid from this autumn onwards, but where we also discuss much more state aid in a wider context, so the modernization of the state aid package and the most important consequences. But also one lesson we learned from the seminars in the member states was that it was also important to get more feedback on specific sectors. The state aid rules differ considerably from sector to sector. And that is the reason why we've taken the initiative to organize now also more in-depth seminars focusing on specific sectors. The first one we had in January on research and development, and this is now the second one in energy. And we'll organize 3 to 4 more seminars this year and next year on broadband, transport, and other sectors. So we really saw there was a need for a more tailor-made approach and a more in-depth discussion. And that's why we have you here today to discuss state aid in the energy sector. So that's one reason. And the other reason is, of course, because of energy. Energy is an important sector for the structural funds and a sector of growing importance. And of course, also at political level, with the launch of the Energy Union strategy, it's one of the 10 priorities of this commission, of the Juncker Commission. Energy is an important topic on the agenda. And the structural funds should contribute to this political priority. And we can also see this. If we look at the current program period, 2014-2020, we see, for example, that the budget for energy efficiency has tripled. Now about 18 billion euros has been reserved for investments in energy efficiency under the structural funds. Also, the budget for renewables has gone up to 5 billion euros. And also the budget even for energy infrastructure, which is mainly supported more in the least developed regions. Also there we almost have reserved 3.5 billion euros for energy infrastructure. So those are the two main reasons why we organize these seminars. One hand, the importance of state aid, the impact on regional policy and and the level of irregularities, and secondly, the importance for the energy sector as such, the growing importance for the funds. The setup of this seminar today is that we try to make it as interactive as possible. So we really encourage you to ask your questions, make your comments. You have submitted your questions already, some of them already in advance. So you have the possibility we're going to answer your questions later on in one of the next sessions. And also in the afternoon, we're going to discuss concrete case studies, where you can, on the basis of concrete case studies and discussion, we can try to make clear the rules of the game on state aid in energy. But we start, first of all, with two speakers. We're going to set the framework to explain the rules for state aid in the energy sector. But before giving the floor to them, I just would like to say, and probably my colleagues from DG Competition are going to say this as well, today is really a learning exercise. So we exchange information about how the rules of state aid work, but of course it cannot be seen as a kind of informal notification or pre-notification meeting. So you can come up with your questions for your concrete cases, but of course the colleagues from DG Competition cannot take formal positions on your questions. So it's mainly for explaining how the rules of the game work. Having said that, I would like now to invite the first speaker, Diana Barglazan from DG Competition, and who's going to explain and set the framework for state aid rules in energy. Diana?
Okay, thank you. So, hello, and today this will be a presentation about the state aid rules for energy and environment. I thought this presentation might be better to just do it together with my colleagues who will be in charge of the case studies in the afternoon. That way you also have the chance to see them. So for the second and third part, I will invite them also here. So how the presentation is structured. Of course, before we talk about what rules apply to state aid in energy and environment, the main thing is to know what exactly state aid is. So we'll start with that. Then we have the guidelines. We have the general block exemption regulation. We'll talk about specific rules for different categories, for different type of projects. And well, the session of questions and answers, actually, it will be a bit after the next presentation. But we can start. I mean, what is state aid? I still have this issue whenever I talk to new people that I met, and they ask, what do I do, where I work? DG Competition seems to be fine. People know what competition is. They heard of cartels. But the moment I say state aid, usually the next question is, so what kind of projects are you financing? Can I get the financing for my project? Well, no, that's a misunderstanding. So, yes, so, sorry, I should use this. The other way, perfect. So state aid is defined in Article 107, and we are dealing with state aid because the people who founded the European Union thought it's very important and put this in the treaty. And the treaty says that any aid granted by a member state through state resources or in any form whatsoever, which distorts or threatens to distort competition by favoring certain undertakings or the production of certain goods, actually shall be prohibited. That's the text that is missing here, insofar as it affects trade between member states. So as a general rule, state aid is prohibited, but of course for certain activities, for certain projects, which aim for an objective of common interest, there are exceptions, and in certain conditions, state aid is allowed. And we are going to talk exactly about these instances where state aid is allowed. So what does it mean for state aid? What you need to remember as important elements when we talk about state aid. A measure will be state aid if there are state resources involved, if it's granted by the state or through state resources, if the measure is selective, so a very general measure for the whole economy of a member state will normally not be selective. If, I don't know, let's say if the level of a tax is reduced, that's not selectivity, but if it's reduced only for certain undertakings, it's something else. There has to be an advantage, so there is a selective advantage. It has to favor some companies, make their situation better than under market conditions. And yes, it's about undertakings. But undertakings, here we will need to clarify a few things. Undertakings are not really commercial companies that are profit-oriented all the time. An undertaking is usually defined as any entity that carries out an economic activity, meaning offers services and goods on the market. So it can be a company, but it can also be an NGO, it can be even a public authority. There are quite different possibilities, so it's in a very wide sense. Distortion of competition, it's almost assumed to happen when the state intervenes in the economy and gives money to certain actors, to certain entities involved. Usually it favors those entities to the expense of others, and it changes a bit the game on the market. Effects on trade, well, it's also almost a presumption, but of course there have to be some signs, some estimations that it's really foreseeable that the trade between member states will be affected. For example, if the measure is very small, if it's up to 200,000 euro, it's considered so small that it will not impact the trade between member states, and it's covered by the de minimis regulation. It's not considered state aid. For other situations, it can be checked, and of course there are some very local activities and businesses that will not meet this criteria, but otherwise it's quite easy. I mean, with the internal market, with services and goods exchanged very widely between member states, or in particular if we talk about energy, pretty much all forms of energy are widely traded between member states, so the actions of the state are really expected to have an impact. There is a notion, a notice on the notion of state aid, which was adopted by the Commission quite recently, and I highly recommend for all the people who have to deal with state aid to have a look, because it's basically a collection of case law and case practice and explaining how the Commission really sees all these elements, what is considered to be state aid and what not. So that would be the introduction about what is state aid. Now, the guidelines that we have, the energy and environmental aid guidelines, are a collection of rules covering most of the situations in which state aid is allowed for energy, so in the energy sector, as well as for environmental purposes. It does not mean that everything that is not covered by the guidelines is absolutely prohibited. There is still a possibility to assess whatever does not fall within the scope of the guidelines under the treaty or under different rules. But yeah, most of the situations are usually covered. The guidelines that we apply now are in force since 2014. They have a part of common assessment principles, which I think simplifies quite a lot the assessment and makes it clearer what kind of elements we are looking at in the Commission and why we are looking at those elements. There are specific rules for certain categories of aid, not for all the categories that are within the scope of the guidelines, and I will mention later why. And there are some thresholds for individual notification. So for very large aid measures, there will be an individual assessment, a more in-depth assessment of the measure to really verify that the conditions are met more in general, while usually we deal quite often with schemes and then we look in the aggregate, but in the aggregate can be very different from one beneficiary to another. So it can be perfectly fine for most beneficiaries, while for the largest ones, due to economies of scale and so on, it can be more advantageous, let's say. Okay, common assessment principles, I would like to mention this as well because it's really important, and if you manage to understand them and keep them in mind, it's quite easy to understand the criteria and to understand why we apply certain criteria. So in principle, state aid is prohibited, but it's allowed when it's aimed to an objective of common interest. So when the measure that is financed with state aid really contributes to an objective of common interest. And then we check some other elements. We check if the aid is necessary. So if the beneficiary would have done the project anyway, even without state aid, then of course we have doubts if the aid is really well spent and if the public monies are well spent. If there is no need for aid, the state should not intervene and distort competition normally. Then we check if the aid is appropriate. Perhaps there are other means through which the same objective can be reached easier, like regulatory measures. Sometimes this is not the case, so it's not a very, very strict test, but still it's something that we verify. If the aid really is appropriate and is able to contribute to help this project just happen. Then we check if the aid is proportional. So we can decide that aid is necessary, but how much aid is necessary? Perhaps the same project could go ahead very well also with less aid than what is initially proposed. So we have to check that the aid is really kept to the minimum necessary and the beneficiaries will not get very high profits and very high benefits out of this. Just a reasonable profit. Of course, they are carrying economic activities, and for that it's normal to expect a reasonable profit. And then we check basically the negative effects. And we also check to what extent the authorities have thought about how to avoid or how to limit the negative effects, like the effects on trade and the distortion of competition. A final element that is perhaps new, well, it was there all along, but now it's really explicit, is transparency. So we expect aid measures to be transparent, and we think that also the citizens and all the economic entities and the competitors and everyone should be entitled to know what the aid is given for, how the public money are spent, and to what extent some entities, some undertakings benefit of some advantages. Then the scope of the guidelines. Well, here on the first slide are some elements for which it might seem strange at the first sight. You have them within the scope of the guidelines, but you do not really have specific rules for them. Why is that? Because for these measures, the Commission already has a lot of experience, and all these 4 types of measures are covered by the block exemption regulation, and they are assessed only if they exceed the threshold under an individual notification. So this would cover aid for going beyond the standards. If a company wants to go farther with environmental protection and go beyond the standards or improve the environmental protection in the absence of standards, aid for such projects is allowed. It's also aid for early adaptation to standards. If a standard will be mandatory in a few years, if a company wants to already meet that standard, we think certain incentives are justified, under certain conditions, of course. Aid for environmental studies, aid for remediation of contaminated sites. You will see more in detail the rules that can apply. Then there is a large part for which you have specific rules in the guidelines, like aid for energy from renewable sources, be it electricity or other forms of energy, like heat or biofuels. Aid for efficiency measures, and this includes cogeneration, and this includes also district heating and cooling, energy efficient district heating and cooling. Then we have aid for resource efficiency, in particular for waste management, aid for CO2 capture, carbon storage, carbon capture storage, and similar projects. Aid in the form of reductions from environmental taxes. Here the logic is a bit that we want member states to impose environmental taxes and help protect the environment, but sometimes for certain categories of beneficiaries, these taxes can be a very high burden. And then for them, there might be necessary to have a relief, because without such a relief, either those companies will not be able to survive, either the states will not be incentivized to apply high levels of environmental taxes and we just reduce the tax for everyone, which is not the ideal outcome. Then we have something similar with reductions from environmental taxes, but which refers to reductions from the funding of renewable, energy from renewable sources. Because the renewable sector has been developing a lot, and because the financing is usually done through certain levies. So all the users contribute to the financing through these levies. And these levies have increased quite dramatically in the recent years. And they have become, for some companies which are energy intensive, quite a burden. So now we have these rules available for them to receive some relief. Aid for energy infrastructure is something new. Before it was assessed under the guideline, under the treaty directly. Now we have the rules under the guidelines. Aid in the form of tradable permits and aid for relocation of undertakings. For these two categories, I don't think we have a lot of cases, but aid is allowed for such type of projects. I will refer also to the threshold for individual notification. This is taken from the guidelines, but what I want to mention, and I think it's very important for you to know, is that more or less the same thresholds apply for measures under GBER, in particular the general threshold for investment aid, 15 million. So for many measures, you can go under the block exemption regulation, which means you will not need to notify. But for projects for which the aid exceeds 15 million, there is an obligation to notify the measure, and there will be a detailed assessment. Well, for operating rate aid for renewables, the threshold is a bit different. Under GBER, you will have a general budget limitation for the scheme at 150 million euro per year. For cogeneration as well, for biofuels as well. And then for energy infrastructure is the same threshold, 50 million euros. And yes, carbon capture and storage is not applicable under the block exemption regulation, and also generation adequacy is not applicable under the block exemption regulation. Another thing that is quite interesting, I think, in the new guidelines for this threshold for individual notification is that when you have a competitive bidding process for attributing the aid, then there is no limit. Then there is no obligation for individual assessment and for detailed assessment from our side. This being said, the block exemption regulation is also enforced since 2014, and what it means, it simply means that whatever measures fall under the scope of this block exemption regulation and fulfill the conditions can be applied by the member states without having to notify and wait for the approval of the Commission. The Commission still needs to be informed about the measure, but the member state can do its own assessment and just go ahead with these projects, which simplifies quite a lot. So usually these are measures for which the Commission has enough experience to be able to say if this and that condition is respected, then the aid is fine and is compatible with the internal market. There are thresholds for notification. There are now also thresholds for evaluation. We think it's important for big measures for the member states to also do an evaluation and to see how the measure really performed. There were certain expectations in terms of contribution to the objective of common interest, but have these expectations been met? Was the scheme really effective? Can it be improved in case the member states wants to continue and to prolong it? There was the objective of a state aid modernization to have most of the measures under the block exemption regulation. The target was set at 90%, and it was considered extremely ambitious and by many people quite unrealistic. But we are pretty much there. So it was 85, 86% a year ago, and now it's even better. So we are really about 90% of all the measures being covered by the block exemption regulation, which means that we only see about 10% of the measures, usually the most complex and complicated ones, of course. Yeah, there is an environmental section. It mirrors very much the rules we have under the guidelines. Not everything is covered, so measures for which we don't really have enough experience were not included in the block exemption regulation, but most of the measures are included, and the rules are very, very similar. Sometimes they are a bit stricter under GBER because, well, there is no checking, no verification from the Commission side, so it has to be just what is clear and straightforward. The scope of the environmental section under GBER covers aid for environmental protection, for measures that help the undertakings go beyond standards or improve environmental protection in the absence of standards, for early adaptation to standards, aid for energy efficiency. There is a special article for energy efficiency in buildings, but that we will present a bit later. Aid for renewable energy, for cogeneration, for remediation of contaminated sites, reductions and exemptions from environmental taxes, usually reductions, recycling, reutilization, energy infrastructure, environmental studies, energy efficient district heating and cooling. So pretty much all that is covered. Now, to continue with specific rules, it will not really follow the structure and the order in which you have these measures in the guidelines or in the GBER. We thought to adapt a bit this presentation to the seminar today and to what happens in the afternoon. So the measures are presented a bit grouped, like measures for renewable energy and CHP, and then for energy efficiency and environmental protection, and then energy infrastructure. And at the end, there are left some measures which we in DG Competition think do not present a lot of interest for the authorities dealing with structural funds, like operating aid, taxes, things like that, for which usually the structural and investment funds will not be used. So, investment aid for high efficient CHP, combined heat and power generation, and investment aid for energy from renewable energy sources. The rules are really very similar. It is possible to give aid for such investments, usually for newly installed installation, for cogeneration, also for refurbished installation. For renewables, we do not have such a text in our rules like refurbished installations, but it's good to keep in mind that if there is a refurbishment and there is an additional capacity created, that counts as a new project, as new capacity, and therefore it's eligible for aid. In terms of aid intensity, we have ranges. For those of you who might be familiar with previous rules, this is a change now. Why do we have ranges? Because the bottom of this range, so in this case 45%, will be the aid intensity normally applicable to large undertakings that cannot benefit of other bonuses. If the companies are smaller, they are entitled to get more aid. So for medium companies, we add 10%. For small companies, we add 20% as compared to the aid intensity allowed for large undertakings. And now we also have bonuses for assisted regions. So for assisted regions, depending on their type, there can be a bonus of 5 or 15%, which means that in the end, for a small company that operates in an assisted region, the aid intensity can be up to 80%. There are some special rules for renewables in certain cases, but please keep in mind that this is really the exception. So the rule is the normal aid intensity, which is applied to extra investment costs. For very specific installations, it can be extremely difficult to find a counterfactual. And then we allow aid up to a lower aid intensity from the total investment cost. But these situations are quite rare. And since I mentioned extra investment cost, what does it mean? Well, for environment protection in general, we consider that the aid should be determined based on the extra costs. Because normally, energy is produced, and it's something normal, and the market is functioning well to allow production of energy. The thing is that if you want the energy to be produced from renewable sources or in high-efficient cogeneration plants, the costs are higher. So then we think the aid should cover a part of this extra cost, what costs more in these scenarios compared to the normal generation of energy. And why just a part and not all of them? Because we do not really look into operating costs and revenues anymore. It's just about the investment. But normally you would expect for such for such investments being high efficient cogeneration or energy produced from renewable energy sources, to have some savings during the lifetime of the project, to be more efficient and to allow a reduction of the operating costs, and therefore there will be some gains on this side. This being said, I think I will invite my colleague Christos Peolidis for the second part, which is about energy efficiency and other environmental measures.
So, my name is Christos Peolidis. I'm case handler responsible for energy efficiency, for the assessment of energy efficiency measures and environmental measures of the part of the guidelines. As my colleague Diana Barkelesan pointed out, the GBER provisions clearly mirror to a great extent, the provisions of the guidelines. And as regards energy efficiency, more or less the same provisions of the guidelines apply also for GBER. The aid is given only for investments that are necessary to comply, aid is given only for investments that go that are necessary, that are not necessary to comply with the union standards, and the aid amount can be up to 30 to 65% of the extra investment costs. The extra investment costs are the costs compared to a contrafactual. However, when it comes to energy efficiency measures, it's setting the contrafactual depends on what kind of interventions are planned for in the energy efficiency measures. There are specific provisions. Article 38 refers to general measures on energy efficiency, while Article 39 sets some specific provisions that are specifically applied, for buildings. In case of Article 39, aid to buildings is given only via loans or guarantees, basically through financial intermediates. And then there is a threshold also of 10 million euros per project. However, this does not mean, that under Article 38, aid can be given also for buildings, for energy efficiency interventions in buildings can be given also under Article 38, which covers the general provisions on energy efficiency. The provisions of GBER clearly mirror when it comes, to aid to investment aids for going beyond standards or increase the level of environmental protection in the absence of union standards, more or less mirror again the provisions of the guidelines. And this is aid given again to companies that go above the standards, so not to comply with the union standards. The aid amount can be up to between 40 or 75%, depending if it's for a large company or for a small company, and also depending on the area where it operates. Investment aid can also be given for early adaptation of future union standards. In case, a company would like, to apply future union standards at least 1 year before they enter into force. The aid amount in that case can vary between 5 and 40%. Under the guidelines and under the GBER, aid can be given, also for waste recycling and reutilization, waste management and resource efficiency. There is a difference, however, between the GBER provisions and the guidelines provision. Under GBER, only aid can be given for recycling and reutilization facility, for investments for recycling and reutilization, while under the guidelines, aid can be given for waste management and resource efficiency. One of the most important provisions here is that the investments have to go above go beyond the state of the art. And aid is given in that case only for waste that are generated by other undertakings. The aid intensities in this case can vary between 35% and 70%, and they are calculated as extra investment costs compared to a conventional process. Under the guidelines and under GBER, aid can be given for environmental studies. In this case, those studies have to be directly linked to an environmental objective. Those studies can include also energy audits. However, not the mandatory energy audits that are foreseen for large undertakings under Article 8 of Directive 27 of 2012. The aid amount can be, the aid intensity can be between 50 and 85% of the cost of the studies. Of course, here there is no counterfactual to check. And investment aid can be given also for remediation of a contaminated site. In this case, the aid amount is, the aid intensity can be up to 100%, which on the of the costs, of the total cost incurred, for the remediation of the site, minus the increase of the value of the land that incurs after the remediation is done. And of course, it's without saying that the polluter pays principle has to be respected. So it has to clearly be proven, that the recipient of the aid has not polluted the site. So, and now I leave the floor for my colleague Zora Mincheva, who deals with the investment aid for energy infrastructure.
Good morning to everyone. My name is Zora Mincheva. I work in the area of state aid in the energy sector in DG Competition. I will briefly take you through the remaining slides of our presentation. The first one of which is on investment aid for energy infrastructure. Investment aid for energy infrastructure can be granted both under the guidelines and under GBER. If it is to be granted under the guidelines, it has to be for amounts of aid that are up to 50 million euros per undertaking per project. The other important conditions that have to be remembered if the aid is granted under GBER is that investment aid under GBER cannot be granted to storage projects, which means that electricity and gas storage are excluded under the applicable article of GBER. The other important condition to be remembered is that the projects must be located in assisted regions. The eligible costs under GBER are the investment costs, and the maximum aid amount could be calculated as the difference between the investment cost and the operating profit. Very important also to bear in mind is that operating profit shall be deducted ex ante. If this is not the case, they should be deducted later on through a clawback mechanism. Investment aid for energy infrastructure under the guidelines. This is when the aid amount exceeds the 50 million euros per undertaking per project. Again, the eligible costs under the guidelines are the investment costs. The investment costs calculated in terms of the funding gap method, which is the difference between the positive and negative cash flows throughout the lifetime of the project. The aid intensity could reach up to 100%. And another point to remember that under the guidelines, there is a need for such an investment aid if this aid is targeted to projects of common European interest, smart grids, and assisted regions. Which one do I have to press? Oops, sorry for that. Investment aid for energy efficiency, district heating and cooling. Again, this type of aid could be granted both under GBER and under the guidelines, depending on the thresholds. The conditions you see outlined on this slide are those applicable under GBER. Basically, the eligible costs are the extra costs, and the aid intensity could go from 45% for large undertakings to up to 80% for small undertakings located in assisted regions. What are the extra costs? These are basically the difference between what would cost to build, for example, high efficient district heating and the cost of a similar district heating plant which is not high efficient but which is of the same installed capacity as the high efficient one. And the GBER also aid could be granted for a distribution network that services these high-efficient district heating and cooling plants. In that case, again, the eligible costs are the investment costs, and the maximum aid amount is calculated as the difference between the investment costs and the operating profit, which should be deducted ex ante or through a clawback mechanism. The next slide is on operating aid for electricity from renewable sources. Again, this type of aid could be granted both under the guidelines and under GBER. The conditions under the guidelines and under GBER are very similar. The important thing to remember is this aid must be granted through a competitive bidding process, so beneficiaries must be selected on the basis of tendering. These beneficiaries must be subjected to market signals by granting the aid in the form of a premium, by subjecting these beneficiaries to standard balancing responsibilities. And the other very important thing is that aid should not be granted to renewable installations during periods when electricity prices are negative. Of course, aid also should not be granted beyond the full depreciation of installations. And when there is a combination of operating aid to renewable installations and investment aid, the level of the operating aid should be adjusted to take into account the investment aid granted. There are exceptions from these conditions for small-scale installations. So for small-scale installations of installed capacity of up to 500 kilowatts, you can still grant the aid as a feed-in tariff. They do not have to be subject to standard balancing responsibilities. In case of small installations, the aid is limited to the difference between the levelized cost, including a certain rate of return, and the market price of the form of energy concerned. There is a difference between GBER and the guidelines in terms of the level, the allowed level for the rate of return. Under the guidelines, that level is determined as a reasonable level of return. Under the GBER, that level is limited to the relevant slop rate plus a premium of 100 basis points. Aid in the form of reductions in environmental taxes. If you have environmental taxes that are not harmonized, they have to be assessed under the guidelines. Otherwise, they could be assessed under GBER. What is important to remember is in this case that beneficiaries should be selected on the basis of transparent and objective criteria. And again, under GBER, that beneficiaries shall pay at least the respective minimum level of taxation set by the Energy Taxation Directive. Aid in the form of reduction in funding support for RES. This type of aid is assessed under the guidelines. So for this type of aid, member states must submit formal notifications to the Commission. The beneficiaries can only belong to a certain type of sectors determined on the basis of the level of their trade exposure and electro-intensities. These sectors, a list of these sectors can be found in Annexes 2 and 5 of the guidelines. The aid could consist in a reduction of general level of 85% of the cost of financing for renewables. In certain cases, this aid could even be increased, and further reductions are allowed if necessary. Of course, that if further reductions are to be allowed, that should be duly justified. In case such type of aid has been granted by member states in the past, it could still be made compatible with the current requirements of the guidelines, with the help of an adjustment plan, which should bring little by little the level of aid to the applicable levels as allowed under the guidelines. And the last type of measure, which is again covered only by the guidelines, is aid for generation adequacy. What is important to remember here is that aid should be granted only for availability. Such type of measures should be open to new and existing generation, and preferably they should be also opened to other member states. Thank you very much. I think the question and answer session is scheduled after the next speaker, so I would like to give the floor to the state aid expert, Mrs. Maria Segura.
Thank you very much. My name is Maria Segura. I'm a state aid lawyer. And for Diana, it is difficult to say what is a state aid case handler in DG competition. For a state aid lawyer, it even helps to make reference to DG competition and say that we help companies and authorities to provide good schemes and prepare the measures that could allow them to get the green light from DG competition, or in this case, also from DG Regio. So why are we here today? Because of this. We are here because the ESI Funds require that the operations supported by this money, together with the money of the member states, must comply with applicable union law and national law relating to the application, which means that support granted under ESIF needs to comply with state aid rules. There is something additional to the structural funds, which is the ex-ante conditionality. And you know that Article 108 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union provides that there is a general obligation to notify state aid. You've already heard what is state aid, and we will come back again to state aid, what is the definition of state aid. But I think it is important to remember that in principle, there is a prohibition to grant state aid because the market is supposed to function by its own. So the states are not supposed to intervene and distort the market. So in principle, state aid is prohibited, but there are some conditions, some circumstances, some exemptions, on the basis of which aid can be granted. In order to be able to know whether aid can be granted in a certain area, you need to, in principle, notify to the Commission. Since a while, there is a new procedure also foreseen for notification towards the Commission, which is the pre-notification. And that's a procedure where the member state can approach the Commission and discuss with the services of DG Competition in principle whether the measure that they want to implement is in line, and they get help in organizing the measure. But in principle, there is this obligation to notify before a measure is put into place. This obligation has been nuanced since the introduction of the General Block Exemption Regulation, and we will come back later to what it means. But what is important on this slide is that when we're talking about structural funds, we have an additional condition, which is the ex ante conditionality, which means that it must be ensured ex ante that there is an efficient and effective managing and control system in place to establish whether the financial support to a project is state aid and to prevent the grant of illegal and incompatible state aid. And if we start by the end, what is illegal and incompatible aid? Illegal aid is aid that has not been notified, that's been implemented, so it's a support that has been granted to an undertaking before the Commission has said, yes, although it is state aid, you can go ahead and consider go ahead because it is a compatible aid. So incompatible is aid that has not been declared compatible, and illegal is aid that has been granted without having been notified and having received the green light from the Commission services. So why this is very positive that there are ex-ante conditionalities, and this is because it increases the discipline. It increases the discipline at the level of the member states and the different managing authorities. And it increases the discipline also in general towards state aid, the concept of state aid. So there is also a spillover effect on the awareness of how important it is to carry out a proper assessment of the measures before going ahead. Because going ahead without having done the homework properly has very bad consequences, in particular for the undertakings. Not so much for the administration, they'll have additional administrative burden, but there is a big punishment towards the undertakings, to which we will come at the end of the presentation. As managing authorities, you have been given a long list of obligations. So amongst the obligations of managing authorities, we have identified any state aid accurately, properly assess whether remuneration of private or public investors is in line with the market economy operator principle. We will come back later to this concept. You have to apply correctly the state aid rules and exemptions, and that's why we're here today, to go through, as we just did with Diana and her colleagues, to go through the requirements of the environmental and energy guidelines to grant aid for this sector. You have to meet the Commission's administrative requirements for monitoring and aid schemes. And in general, you need to secure compliance with the state aid rules, including the rules on cumulation for funding from different sources. And this is a big challenge. So we will repeat a little bit something that Diana was saying before, because this is fundamental. This is very, very important. In this slide, we will see the presentation of the criteria for state aid in a bit of an alternative manner. So we talk about, here we are, we talk about pretext. So the first thing that we need to find out before we continue with the assessment of whether the support that we want to grant constitutes state aid or not is whether the recipient is an undertaking. And it looks very simple, because an undertaking, according to the definition of the court, is an entity engaged in an economic activity in a market for goods and services, irrespective of its legal form. So whenever someone sells something, a service, a good, fine, it's an undertaking. The problem is that the reality is not as easy as that. To give you an example, we had a case. There was a department of a municipality that was a laboratory, and this laboratory was analyzing the water in the reservoirs of the municipality. Then the municipality had financed this laboratory years after years after years, considering that was a department of the municipality. That was not an undertaking because they weren't carrying out any economic activity outside of the municipality. They considered it was part of the administration. The problem was that there was a laboratory that was an undertaking and wanted to do also these tests. So they lodged a complaint, and they proved that the laboratory, even though it was part of the administration, had been carrying out an economic activity, which was to do the analysis of the water. That's an economic activity that the other company was carrying out. So you need to be very careful when you look at the recipient of the support, whether even though it might not have the legal form of a limited liability company, or it wouldn't be an independent employer, whatever, even though it might be part of an administration, part of another entity, it might be nonetheless an undertaking because it carries out an economic activity. This is fundamental. This is like the first step we need to assess. Then the second step is the state aid test as such. This is what we call here, the state aid test, the 4 criteria or 5 conditions. And this is, I want you to, well, if you look at this, there are 4 criteria, but this is a double criteria that needs to be assessed independently from each other. So the first criteria is state resources. And I mentioned here Preuss and Electra and Vent de Colère. Preuss and Electra was a very famous case law that I think all of you will know about, that considered that it was the German system of supporting renewable energy through conventional electricity producers, and the court considered there were not state resources involved because the monies did not go through a fund by the state, but were directly passed from the undertakings conventional electricity producers to the renewable electricity producers. The case law has evolved a lot since then, thankfully, and we can now quote Vent de Colère, and I will read from the judgment where the court said that the concept of state resources, in principle, covers all the financial means by which public authorities might actually support undertakings irrespective of whether or not those means are permanent assets of the public sector. Even if the sums corresponding to the measure in question are not permanently held by the Treasury, the fact that they constantly remain under public control and therefore available to the competent national authorities is sufficient for them to be categorized as state resources. Which means you don't need to have a special fund at the state where you will collect all the money that you will ask for from consumers, for instance, and then pay to the renewables or to whoever kind of beneficiary you want to choose. You don't need to have a special fund for that, but the fact that you have a control over these resources makes it state resources. And that might be relevant for you as well, depending on where your source of financing beyond the ESI funds will be coming from. The next element is, where are we here? Selective economic advantage. What Article 107 says is that for a measure to constitute state aid, it must grant an advantage to an undertaking. So it must put this undertaking better off than the other. Either they pay less, they get a grant, they have better financing conditions, they're better off than their competitors, they get an advantage. The question is that this advantage can or cannot be selective. For instance, corporate rate in Ireland is 10%, and it was a big scandal at the time when they introduced this tax, but all undertakings paid 10%. So there is no selectivity in the measure because everybody is subject to 10% taxation. If I say now that only electricity producers in Belgium will pay 10% corporate tax, this will be a selective measure because it's only electricity producers that will get a taxation of 10% instead of 33% that the rest of the companies in this country will get. So that's why it is important to always make a separate, nuanced assessment of whether a measure is an advantage and whether this advantage is selective because it only concerns some, or it is not selective and is applicable to all. The next one is distortion of competition, which is if one undertaking is better than the others, obviously there is normally a distortion of competition and effect on trade. If the problem with the concept of effect on trade is that the case law of the court has had a very broad interpretation of this concept, so that even a local hairdresser could be considered to be affected by trade because you have this big chain like I don't know, Tony and Guy or whatever big chain you can think of hairdressers. So you could have investments in this area of the economy, and therefore, to put a very extreme example, it's very difficult to consider that there is no effect on trade. The Commission has tried several times and has been successful in some instances because it goes a little bit far, the concept of effect on trade. So now, this is, in general, the definition of state aid of which you need to be aware. Then, once you know that a measure constitutes state aid, then you need to check whether this state aid can be considered compatible because it complies with the conditions, requirements, objectives of, in this case, energy, support for energy. You have three possibilities to consider support in the area of energy compatible. The first one is the minimis, and Diana mentioned is aid below 200,000. The second one is the general block exemption regulation, and the third one are the environmental and energy aid guidelines. But what you need to consider as the second step is that not everything that is covered by the GBER and by the environmental and energy aid guidelines can be granted aid under the ESIF. So you do the first step. Do I have state aid? The second step, could I consider it compatible? And does it really fit the priorities and the criteria for being granted support under ESIF? Which are the measures covered by ESIF? You have promotion of production and distribution of energy derived from renewable sources, energy efficiency, renewable energy use in enterprises, smart energy management, smart distribution systems, low carbon strategies for all types of territories, high efficiency cogeneration of heat and power based on useful heat demand. So we need to have a little bit of an overview of why these priorities are also financed under the ESIF. And we need to have a little bit of an overview of whether there is coherence between the different EU policies. Because at the end of the day, it is you who will implement these policies in the support that you will grant to the projects in your area. So we have, back in 2010, there was the communication Energy 2020, a strategy for competitive, sustainable, and secure energy, which had several objectives, amongst which there was secure, affordable, and sustainable energy market with upgraded electricity grids, competitive and cleaner energies to replace obsolete plants, energy use more efficiently through the whole energy chain, which are really laudable objectives that we all hope will be achieved. And then the Commission, DG Competition, made an assessment of what the old environmental aid guidelines had brought, where they were used, and how they could be amended. And they found out that about 80% of the monies spent were to the support of renewable energy sources and combined heat and power. And then what they do is they thought the new guidelines should target more generally measures in the energy field. So what they had found out is that regarding renewables, the support scheme were not cost efficient because these feed-in tariffs of premiums, what had happened was that they sheltered producers from the evolution of the market, and they did not force them to adjust to the market. And that was something that was not the purpose that was thought. So one thing is to support a certain technology so that it develops, but it should not shelter, the support should not shelter the technology so that it's not able to adjust to the market. And then the market also did not have, the investment in the market was shifted towards renewable, and there were not sufficient investments in the area of conventional electricity production, like for instance gas, which is also efficient. So then there is the state aid modernization, a whole exercise. It doesn't only concern the environmental and now energy guidelines, but it also concerned other areas of state aid control. and amongst others, RAG, which is here. RAG is regional aid guidelines. I'm sorry, I should have written regional aid guidelines. It's professional deformation. In the past, energy project could also receive funding under the regional aid guidelines. So if you had a plant that was established in an area covered by the regional aid map, then regional aid could be granted. Now this is out of the guidelines, of the regional aid guidelines, and energy as such, any project related to the energy sector should be financed. Should be financed, should any project in the area of energy receive support, this support needs to be checked for compatibility following the criteria of the environmental and energy guidelines. And then we have the GBER, and the GBER is expanded, and under the GBER you can grant aid for energy generation, distribution and infrastructure, provided, and this is quite important, provided that there is a consistency also with the internal market and the union's environmental and energy policy, because we cannot think in boxes. We have to think broad. So state aid should not pursue its own little state aid objectives. It fits into general policies of the union, and we need to be consistent at all levels, at the Commission, at the managing authorities, on which are the priorities that have been identified at the Commission level, so that these priorities will be implemented in the projects that are receiving funding at the local level. So, now, very briefly about the environmental aid guidelines, because the previous interveners made a very, very good presentation. I only want to raise a couple of comments. The objective of the reform of the environmental aid guidelines was to make the rules clearer and simpler, and I think they did a very good job on that. There are definitions in the guidelines, and they're very helpful. I would strongly recommend to very carefully read the definitions, in particular now that we're talking about environmental aid guidelines, and they're very clear and they're very helpful. Then there are common assessment elements for different categories of aid, and these are general principles that we all need to integrate. So we need to have determine a very well-defined objective, necessity. The measure must be appropriate, so to grant state aid is the measure that targets best the objectives that we have and not other measures. The measure must provide an incentive for the action, for the behavior of the companies. It has to be limited to the minimum. This is what we call proportionality. And there shouldn't be any negative effects on competition, because as we mentioned before in the slide regarding state aid, in principle, state aid is prohibited because it gives support to an undertaking that is competing with other undertakings that don't get the support, and in theory the market should work, and then the best continue and the others have to improve, basically. So that's why in principle the state aid is prohibited, but there are good objectives that allow member states and public authorities to support some undertakings so that their behavior is targeted to a concrete objective. In this case, energy, so promotion of energy efficiency, renewable energies, etc., because the market itself would not have triggered the changes to achieve the objectives that have been set up at European level and then at national level. Then we move to the next piece, which is the GBER. GBER is the General Block Exemption Regulation, which is the cornerstone of the 2014-2020 state aid regime or reform. The Commission wanted to provide an incentive for member states to rely more on the GBER, and there were three changes. The scope of the GBER, that most of you will know and will have applied already in the past, in the previous GBER, has been widened. So we had first the GBER in 2008, and now the 2014 GBER covers more categories of aid. As Diana was mentioning, is based on the experience of the Commission. There are sufficient elements, sufficient criteria, sufficient precedents that allow the Commission to put a big amount of aid measures into the GBER. To put the grant of aid under the GBER is very important for administrative purposes that you know something. So if you decide that one of the support measures that you will implement falls under the GBER, because you look at the text, the one that fell some minutes ago, that's the GBER. And then you have designed a measure, and then you have found out that all the criteria for your measure that are here are complied with, are fulfilled. Then you're happy because you don't have to notify this measure. You can go ahead. Once you have designed the measure, you have identified the beneficiary, you have complied with all the requirements set out in the GBER, then you can go ahead. You don't need to wait 2 months for the Commission to give you the green light after a notification, except for the fact that you need to send to the Commission what they call the information sheets. So you will go ahead, but you will send, before you go ahead, a paper, a form to the Commission, notifying them that this is your block exempted measure that you will implement. And you provide a bit of information to this. So this allows the Commission to have an overview of the measures that are implemented by the Member State, to see which areas the GBER is used, but also to monitor that. And we will come back to that in the next slide, but I think it is important in this slide that you remember that the GBER gives you a fantastic opportunity to save time, but it puts certain obligations on you, which is, first of all, to check that the measure really complies with the GBER, and then send the information sheet to the Commission, because that's one of the obligations. Since you've been through the ex-ante conditionalities, you know very well your obligations. So then second change that was incorporated through the GBER is that the maximum allowable aid intensity for some types of aid has been raised, which is a good news, and that many thresholds for notification of individual amounts have also been raised. And Diana mentioned before, the thresholds in the GBER and in the environmental aid guidelines in several areas are the same. So it covers several measures, but since you provided a very good overview, we skip this one, and then we go directly to the common challenges that we have when we are applying the environment, when we want to grant aid in the sector of energy. The first challenge is the definition of objectives. And I said before, there are the Europe 2020 strategy, the Europe 2020 objectives. So that's the chapeau, that's the general framework. So one of the objectives there are regarding climate change and energy. You have the 20% greenhouse emissions reduction, 20% renewable energy, 20% increase in energy efficiency. And then you have the objectives covered by ESIF. And we also had a look at the different measures that can be covered under ESIF. And then you need to know, what do you want to support? What are the policy objectives that your region, your area has? And this you need to take all into account to design your measure. But when you design your measure, you also need to know what kind of support you want to give, what form of aid you want to give. Do you want to give a grant that you co-finance? Do you want to give a soft loan? Because there are also consequences of the type of measure that you use for the compatibility of the measure, and also consequences in national law regarding taxes and regarding the efficiency of the support, etc. So first, the first bullet point, so to say, means how difficult your work is to define the measures to grant support in the area of energy or any other area. Then you have the financing. And in particular in the area of energy, there are elements that make it a little bit complicated, because there is a lot of legislation in internal market that needs to be respected. And I think it is very important to remember, for instance, you were talking about taxes, and taxes is something that you will normally not use, but you have legislation in internal market that applies to the sector of energy that needs to be respected by the programs of support of using state aid. Then you have the next challenge, which is the determination of the eligible cost. And Diana was mentioning before, in the past there was a different method to determine what are eligible costs. Now you take investment costs, and then you see what are the extra investment costs that the environmental friendly behavior requires, and then you will take into account this extra investment costs to determine what is the amount. These are the eligible costs, and then you will determine how much aid you will be able to grant for this particular project, applying the aid intensities to the extra investment costs. It looks easy, but it is not easy. So it looks easy if you have a separate investment that can be clearly identified. But it is not easy when we come to some counterfactuals And I'll give you one example of my prior life to being a lawyer, which was I was a case handler at the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which is more or less like the Commission, but for Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. And there we also assess state aid. And if I can give you the hint, there are some decisions in the state aid area that the EFTA Surveillance Authority has adopted, in particular in the energy and environmental aid sectors, that were quite advanced, because Norway is very active in this sector, and they provide a lot of guidance as well, a little bit on parallel to the Commission. So there was a company that was active in silicon production, and this company wanted to replace the existing installations with a recovery energy recovery system. What they wanted to do is to recover the heat that was produced by the silicon production. They wanted to reuse it and produce, from the gases, they wanted to produce energy and then use the energy. And that was very fine. So you could think, fine, then you can establish what is the counterfactual, what would have been the investment if it hadn't been an environmental friendly investment. So the question was that the company said, if we wouldn't get aid, we wouldn't have invested because our installations were good enough. So you don't have any energy efficiency gain because they don't invest. So is the counterfactual zero? Or is the counterfactual a similar investment that would have been done by another undertaking whose installations had not been in good shape? So what ESA at the time decided is that indeed the company sufficiently justified why indeed they would not have invested, and therefore they took the whole investment as being eligible. But this is only to show that even something as simple as, might look as simple as that extra investment cost is not always so straightforward to know what is the extra investment. Then there is another element which is very positive, and this is the introduction of competitive elements such as bidding procedures. This is something that will be compulsory from 2017, and is, now there is 5% of the renewables that must be supported using the a bidding procedure, but we have a very good example also in the practice of the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which is the Norwegian Energy Fund. And the Norwegians already for a long time have used bidding procedures. And what they do is they open a tender, and for instance, for energy efficiency. And then all companies that want to receive support for their projects in energy efficiency will bid. They will present their project, and they will turn the amount of aid that they are requesting, they will turn it into an amount of NOK per energy produced. So the ones that require more support, they're lower in the result of the bid, and the ones that require less support will score higher, and therefore will get the support. So there is an economic efficiency element in the investment of the state that is integrated. And this has showed to be very efficient for the state. But I'll tell you also an example of failure by an undertaking in the bidding process. That was an undertaking that was producing ferrosilicon, and they wanted to have, they were cooling the gases that were produced out of their production system. And they decided, this is wasted, we should have an efficient recovery system. So what they decided was to invest in a unit that would recuperate this gas, will produce electricity. The company will have to buy less electricity from the market. They could even put a bit of electricity into the grid. And the gases that were left after all this process, they could sell to another company. So it was a fantastic win-win situation. They bid for this energy fund, and they got financing. And that was very good, everybody very happy. The problem was that they underestimated the cost. And then halfway, they discovered that with the amount of aid that they had gotten, they could not accomplish the project. And this leads us to the next very important point when we're talking about state aid, which is the incentive effect. What they did then was to ask another body for extra support. And this other public entity was willing to give them the missing amount of money. The problem was that there was no incentive effect because the project had already started. And you need to give the support before the project has started. So that's a very fundamental element that I jump a little bit before over that. I didn't stress it enough, but it is fundamental that the companies request the support before they start the project. And I think this is something that everybody has already very well integrated, but in a case like that, then the dilemma was, the fact that they don't get additional support stops the project. Can we consider that there is an incentive effect in the continuation of the project, because otherwise the objective would not be reached? And what ESA decided is, no, sorry, incentive effect is incentive effect. It's a very hard criterion, so you cannot receive additional funding. You should have done your homework properly at the beginning and should have calculated the cost in a realistic way, because otherwise, by under budgeting your projects, you can gain the tender, but then the project is not realistic, so what's happening is that the state is spending money for nothing. So, and then the last slide, and I'm finishing, is the one-size-fits-all approach under the GBER. Here you are from 22 different member states, and all your member states are very different from each other. So the GBER provides general conditions based on the experience of the Commission to approve aid in areas where they have a lot of experience, and this is very good. But the circumstances of each member state, of each region, of each area are very different. And very often you do not find sufficient elements in the GBER to address the particular problem that you want to give support to. It seems that there have been 750 questions in the frequently asked questions on the GBER, which means that there is a big scope of maneuver at the level of the users of the GBER to get guidance from the Commission. It's a good project, but also all projects need probably a bit fine-tuning, also a little bit more experience at the level of the managing authorities, of local authorities. And then that's the last element, sorry. The question is that at the end of the day, when you're using the GBER, you're accountable. It is your responsibility to do the assessment. It is your responsibility to send this information sheet to the Commission. And if you don't do it right, then the Commission will come and monitor, which is very good, because this is their duty. But in case everything goes wrong, and the aid should not have been granted because it could not have been considered compatible under GBER or under the guidelines or whatever, then the undertakings that receive the aid will have to repay it. And an undertaking that has to repay aid has to pay compound interest. And normally undertakings trust the authorities. And it's not only the financial punishment or pain that the undertaking will experience when it has to recover the aid, it's also a loss in reputation by the good administrative practice of the authorities. That's why we all have an interest in having a proper application of the state aid rules from the Commission until the last undertaking receiving the aid. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, it works. Great. I have a question for Mrs. Yes. My name is Bart Lauwers. I'm from the Netherlands, managing authority on the south of the Netherlands. I have a question for Ms. Segura. You talked about a counterfactual situation, I think, in a producer of silicons with the heat that was extracted. You said because it was an extra investment, if I'm right, there was no need for a counterfactual because, well, it was extra, so you could, the total amount of investment was eligible. What if somebody starts like a tidal energy plant, a new plant? Should you compare this with the situation that you have like a polluting installation, like a coal plant or something like that? And should you compare it? And is the difference between the most polluting scenario and the environmentally friendly scenario, are those the eligible costs? And I'm referring to article 41 of the GBER, I think.
Well, probably I'll give the word to my colleague because she will give you more the official answer. So the example I gave was an extreme example to show that it is not so straightforward to justify what is the counterfactual. But you also have situations where the counterfactual can be zero because the company would not have done something else. There are several caveats that I have to put to this example, even if I put a provocative example. This happened in 2011. I don't think today would fly to say it very directly, because also there is much more experience on what kind of counterfactuals can be provided. Now you have in the guidelines a list of counterfactuals already for different areas of investment in the energy sector. So already you have a lot of guidance from the Commission. And for tidal installations, probably Diana, as I said, is better placed to know what is the counterfactual that they require right now. But I don't think that you can say my counterfactual is a very polluting whatever situation. What you need to know is, for this particular investment, what would have happened had I not received this state support? And this is not a very polluting, because that would not have been what you would have done in the absence of the state support. So in the absence of state support, either you would invest, but it's very rare, or you would have invested, for instance, in conventional electricity or conventional something. So you always have, in principle, nearly always have a possibility to find a counterfactual on a realistic investment that could have been an alternative to environmental friendly. But
Yes, okay. I will add a few things. So indeed, for renewables, for tidal and any sort of renewable, we usually take a counterfactual, a conventional electricity producing plant. We are aware that for a specific beneficiary who is really specialized in a certain type of renewable technology, they will probably in reality not invest in something conventional. But if there is such an investment that would make economic sense, if on the market investing in an electricity plant, coal, gas, whatever, would make economic sense, would provide a sufficient rate of return, that for us is a counterfactual. For renewables, as I said, it's quite rare to find situations where you don't have anything, no investment as counterfactual. We had this discussion with some member states on interpretation questions for cogeneration, though. We have an Annex 2 in the guidelines saying which would be the typical counterfactual, but typical doesn't mean it has to be that counterfactual all the time. It's what we most frequently see and what we think is appropriate, but it can differ. So from cogeneration, we think that the typical counterfactual would be a simple plant producing only electricity or only heat, depending what's the main energy to be produced, of the same capacity. And then we had member states saying, yeah, but actually for us it will still be cogeneration, but it's not a high efficient one. So then can we take the total investment to make it high efficient? Well, not really. And then it's really on a case-by-case situation. So for such a thing, and this is a bit similar with what Maria presented, when you replace something that already exists, then you can have the situation that the counterfactual will be no investment. For cogeneration, we also said, well, if you have already a cogeneration plant, which is not high efficient, you have to see first how the plant is. is it really in a good shape? Is it true that you can use it for another, I don't know how many years without any investment? If this is really the case, then yes, your counterfactual will be no investment at all. But if your plant, existing one, is at the end of the lifetime and you would need to replace it anyway in 1 or 2 years, or at least a major part of it, then that investment that you would need to do anyway without the aid is the counterfactual. So.
Good morning, Marcin Janiak, Polish Minister of Energy. First of all, I would like to thank you all the speakers for these interesting presentations. And going back to a presentation of Ms. Maria Segura, I would like to say that I'm afraid that one of the objectives of the state aid modernization hasn't been achieved. I have in mind here this make the rules clearer and simpler. From the practical point of view, I have to say that that objective might be not achieved. Nevertheless, my question is, because in the presentation of Mrs. Bargazan, she raised that state aid for district heating and cooling should be in line with provision of energy efficient directive for energy efficient district heating and cooling systems. And I have a question to representatives of the European Commission. What was the reason, what was the aim of exclusion of district heating investments that are not in line with this provision of energy efficient directive? Here I would like to stress that according to these rules, about 90% of Polish district heating companies are excluded from possibility of granting of state aid. So, and here we have the great potential of increasing energy efficiency and limitation of CO2. And having in mind that we have to achieve goals of Europe Strategy 2020, without these tools, because state aid rules doesn't give us that tools to achieve that goals, I'm afraid that it might be really difficult to aim these goals in the end. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, that was a question that comes back quite repeatedly for interpretation questions. With stated rules, we follow a little bit also the policy, and our understanding is that the whole idea is now to incentivize district heating to move toward energy efficiency, because there is quite a big difference in terms of efficiency, in terms of reducing emissions, CO2, and so on. And yes, our rules, I mean, here is really a very big difference to what happened before, because in the past, before the 2014 guidelines, infrastructure was excluded from the scope of the guidelines. And then we made a separate assessment directly under the treaty. And in Poland, just like in other member states, we had cases where indeed there were district heatings. It was just the network that was replaced. That went under the treaty. We did not look at all at the production plants, and that was found compatible. In the meantime, this has changed, and infrastructure is covered as well under the guidelines now. And it's difficult to say, and well, first of all, what we already have at the level of DG Comp as an agreed line is that district heating should move to energy efficiency. We realize this is difficult. We agreed already that this can be done in stages, so it will be perfectly fine to provide aid in a first stage to improve the network, as long as there is a second stage in which also the production plant will be improved to make it energy efficient. And then I would add a personal comment. I also come from a country in Eastern Europe, from Romania, and there are also these problems, and it's a huge difference between the type of district heating that you can see in some Western countries and the type of district heating that you have in some parts in Central Eastern Europe. And there, indeed, it's a bit far from being energy efficiency. I don't know if 90%, but anyway, a big percentage would be out. But on the other hand, it's also, in so many cases, so inefficient that if you just improve a bit the network, but you keep all the rest, it's not sure that that improvement would really make sense.
Maybe that's not the reply totally to your satisfaction, but at least that's the reply from the Commission at the formal position. I would propose that we break up now for a coffee break, and I also propose that we shorten it a little bit so that we can catch up for the rest of the program. So I propose that we have 15 minutes coffee break, and of course the speakers who gave the introduction this morning are available for further questions. So once again, thank you very much for the colleagues from each competition and for Maria for giving setting the framework for the rest of the day and giving us an introduction to the State University. And see you later. Not travel to Brussels today or are in Brussels and could not participate in this workshop, that they can still follow this seminar. So welcome also to the people who follow during the web stream. The presentations which you see here today and which the participants here received as handouts, they're not yet uploaded on our website, but they will be uploaded on the website after the seminar. So you will be able to also find all the information after the seminar. As said, now the second part, we're going to move one step more concrete, more operational, and to get also more experience from let's say, from the ground, from how it works in practice with state aid and energy projects. And our first speaker is Pedro Kusiala from Jaspers. I think you will know Jaspers. Jaspers helps member states in order to prepare especially their major projects and complex projects before they can be approved for co-financing by structural funds. And Pedro is a state expert in Jaspers, and he will speak mainly from the perspective of beneficiaries and from his own experience. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for DG Regio for inviting me to this workshop, which I think they are very useful, these seminars, workshops which are being organized. They try to solve common problems which come up in this case in energy, in the energy sector, in projects which are funded by the ESIF. And as Pascal has said, I will try to present some points which are based in our experience, in Jasper's experience assisting large infrastructure projects, and therefore it will try to focus very much in some issues which have been dealt with shortly or not so shortly in the previous presentations, but also in some other. So I will deal both with procedural and with substantive issues. Procedural issues sometimes become a key to the whole project application process, and I will try to show you the best practices in terms of the timing of not only the notification as I have written, but in general the assessment of the existence and compatibility of state aid in these type of projects, and also the crossings with the incentive effect, which we have quickly, the previous Diana, Maria, they have mentioned the incentive effect. I will also go into that, especially focusing also with the timing of the notification and the whole preparation of the project process. Then I will go for the substantive issues, and I will deal quickly with a very tricky article or paragraph, which is paragraph 8 of Article 61 of the Common Provision Regulations, which probably you are aware of its content, but we will go through that. And then another topic which has been already discussed, which is the correct identification of counterfactuals. I think that very much covers many of the issues which come up regularly when preparing large infrastructure projects, or probably also for minor projects it would also apply. So here I have described all the project cycle, the so-called project cycle, from the moment of the project identification up to the submission of the application, project approval, and then the implementation. And in parallel, you see how you can deal with state aid. Now, as you see, from the very first moment, state aid can play a role, and it is important that you take it into account when preparing the application. So from the moment you make the project identification, you probably can already predict what will be the main state aid issues. If you will have to make a notification, if not, if there are some doubts, in case, for instance, you would need to, or you would think that it is a service of general economic interest, some particular conditions apply as well. You would have to make an entrustment act, and so on and so on. So already at the moment of the project identification, you are able to a great extent, know what you will do in terms of state aid or what you will have to do in terms of state aid. You have now, later, the pre-feasibility study and the feasibility study. Now, at that moment already, you should move on. If you will have to do a notification, if you have already a pre-feasibility study, you can enter into pre-notification discussions with the Commission, and that would definitely be useful for speeding up the whole project approval, because at the end of the day, that is the main implication probably. The fact that if you start looking at state aid too late, for instance, just before the grant application, that would create delays. The Commission won't approve any project if the questions on state aid are not solved. So if there's a notification pending, or the approval pending after a notification to DG Comp, the Commission won't approve the grant application. So that's why it is important to do it as soon as possible. And in particular in energy projects, the notifications are quite complex. There are many technical and financial data which have to be assessed by the Commission, and from our experience, this can take very long. But mainly at the stage of the preparation of the notification to DG Comp. It is there where sometimes there are some deficiencies, or even there are some facts which are unknown for the managing authority, for the beneficiary, and that creates delays. The preparation itself of the pre-notification, we have had cases where it takes 1 year. And then if there would be an approval without a correct assessment and exercise of state aid rules in that particular project, as we have mentioned before, that can end up with a recovery of the state aid, which has been granted. So in this case, even of the grant, of the ESIF grant. I also put it in parallel because many of the information which you prepare for the grant application is very useful and even necessary for the state aid notification. So CBAs, the feasibility study, all that, it's very useful for the Commission to have it, and there cannot be contradictions. You cannot go make it separate procedures and go to DG Comp and say one thing, and then in the application you are saying something completely different. You have to work together on those two procedures because they really are very close, and the information provided is the same in many aspects. So really go in parallel, and the moment you start the project application preparation, include also the state aid assessment, because it's really necessary. It also has, and there I come to the incentive effect, the state aid assessment has implications also in terms of the incentive effect. And therefore, if you do a late project application, or let's say if you make a late aid application, this can have implications later also at the level of the compatibility assessment. And it might make that all the project is ineligible to receive state aid. So this is related to the incentive effect. And what is the incentive effect? The main idea, and that is very important to keep in mind, is that the Commission considers that aid does not present an incentive effect for the beneficiary in all cases where work on the project has already started prior to the aid application by the beneficiary to the national authorities. So, the idea of the incentive effect is that as a result of the aid, the beneficiary should engage in additional activities that it wouldn't carry out without the aid. So if there are some activities which in any case are going to be carried out, there is no incentive effect, there is no reason to grant state aid. That is something which it surprisingly is quite difficult for some people to understand. State aid is only there to tackle market failures. So if there's no market failure, if the project is going to be implemented anyway, you cannot grant state aid just to increase the profitability of the project. And based on that idea, it's because also you have to present an application for receiving the aid before you start the work on the project. Because if you start the works on the project, that implies that you are considering that this project can be carried out without state aid. That's the logic behind it, and that's the assumption that the Commission makes, that if you didn't make an application before starting the works, it means that you were thinking that you could carry the works out until the end without state aid. Now, the question here is what is considered as an application form? And when is it considered that it's too late to present that application form in order to receive aid? Now, the application form has to include at least the applicant's name and the size of the undertaking. I will read it from here. A description of the project, including the location and start and end dates, the amount of aid needed to carry it out, eligible cost, and a counterfactual scenario. So all that information has to be included in any state aid application in any application for receiving state aid, let's put it like that. Otherwise, if you start the works, and now we come to the next point, start of the works is the start of construction work or the final firm commitment to order equipment, excluding preliminary feasibility studies. So if you start that construction work or you come to the first firm commitment to order equipment without having made such an application, including that information, that aid cannot be granted because there will be no incentive effect. I have also put two exceptions, which the logic behind is probably, well, this aid is considered that it's not big enough to be necessary to apply this principle. It's somehow dubious in my opinion, but there it is fixed in the regulations, so it is applicable. And the exception is the reduction in environmental taxes under Directive 2003/96. There are other reasons also. And paragraph 52 of the guidelines, of the energy and environmental guidelines, related to aid awarded on the basis of a competitive bidding process. In those cases, this principle and this application of the incentive effect does precisely not apply. But in all other cases, this is a basic principle and it has to be respected when implementing your projects. And now a second application of the incentive effect, which we have shortly dealt with before also, which is the following. If an investment is necessary in order to meet mandatory EU standards, since the company would have to comply with those standards in any event, state aid to meet those standards cannot be granted. That is the same logic. You have to meet some standards because you are legally obliged to, so you would do it anyway, whether you receive state aid for it or not. So there is no incentive effect. There is no additional activity which will be triggered by the aid. Now, this is even explicitly mentioned in the guidelines and in the GBER, in relation to the investment aid enabling undertakings to go beyond union standards, because there is where it makes more sense and probably where it is mostly applicable, but it applies in general, and not only obviously to energy projects. This is also a general principle which applies everywhere where there is state aid. Now, you have also to be careful, because sometimes you say, well, an obligation. The state has an obligation to reduce, we cannot whatever % their emissions, so we cannot grant state aid for that. No, that's not what is meant by this rule. The rule applies where the rule addresses the beneficiary undertaking. So it's an obligation which specifically is formulated towards the beneficiary undertakings. And it's then when it comes into play and where it can prevent the granting of state aid. So that an example is that included in Directive 2012-27, that large enterprises have to carry out energy audits every 4 years. There it's clearly directed towards large undertakings. And they have to do it because it's a legal obligation. So there you wouldn't be able to grant state aid. And that second exception, of course, it's where the rule itself, which is imposing that obligation on an undertaking, is at the same time allowing for the granting of state aid to meet those legal obligations. In that case, of course, since there is an exception in the same rule, you would be able to grant those, that state aid. So that's it for the procedural issues. And now the next issue which I want to deal with is, as I said before, the application of paragraph 8 of the Article 61 in the Common Provision Regulation. Article 61, as you probably all know, applies to revenue-generating projects, and it defines which are the eligible costs that can be co-financed through the funds. Now, for establishing these eligible costs, Article 61 provides 3 different methods. The 2 first ones are probably the most important, which is the funding gap calculation and the flat rates. So for the funding gap calculation, you are taking into account the net revenues of the operation ex ante. And that we will see, it's very important to understand also the exceptions which figure in paragraph 8 of Article 61. Now, paragraph 8 of Article 61 says paragraphs 1 to 6 are not applicable in the following cases: where there is de minimis aid granted to the project, where there has been a compatible when compatible state aid is granted to an SME, and an aid intensity or an aid amount limit is applied. So that would be normally the case when you are applying the guidelines or the GBER. And the third case, which is the more tricky one, is where compatible state aid is granted and an individual verification of financing needs in accordance with the applicable state aid rules has been carried out. Now, I want to concentrate on that third point. So what is an individual verification of financing needs? I think it's quite essential to understand that concept, because it will allow you not to carry out the funding gap calculation for identifying the eligible costs for the project. Now, first of all, what is it not? And looking at letter B, we can conclude what letter C is not saying. So it is not a calculation of the maximum aid based on the identification of certain eligible costs without reference to a counterfactual deducting the operating profit and the application to those costs of a minimum aid intensity. So if you only have a calculation method, which is identification of certain eligible costs without reference to the operating profit, so for instance, all the costs of the project are eligible, and to those costs you will apply a maximum aid intensity. Now, that obviously is not an individual verification of financing needs, because it doesn't take into account what are the needs of the project. It just applies a rule which applies everywhere to all type of projects. That would work if it is an SME, of course, because then you would apply letter B. But if it is not an SME, you still would be asked to formulate the funding gap calculation or to apply the flat rate. And, of course, the calculation method has to take into account the individual characteristics of the project, understanding this as the revenues over the lifetime of the project. They have to be taken into account when identifying the eligible costs. Now, even if you have a decision by the Commission, by DG Comp, approving the project, if they are simply applying the guidelines, and the guidelines establish simply an identification of eligible costs and the application of a maximum state aid intensity without taking into account those revenues, then, in my opinion, you are not fulfilling the third letter of Article 61.8, and that is not sufficient, even if it is a decision by the Commission. The same, of course, if you have a state aid scheme which is covering that project. If there is no individual verification of financing needs understood, as I have mentioned before, you will still have to conduct or apply the methods of paragraphs 1 to 6 of Article 61. Now, I also have come up with some examples in order to see, well, okay, now that's on theory, how does that work in practice? And I have taken two examples, one from the guidelines and one from the GBER. Now, the guidelines in their paragraphs 69 to 71 establish that measures subject to an individual assessment, normally the aid will be proportional if they respect this, methodology which figures here. So, as a general principle, aid will be considered to be proportional if the aid corresponds to the net extra costs necessary to meet the objective compared to the counterfactual scenario. The net extra cost is determined by the difference between the economic benefits and costs of the aided project and those of the counterfactual scenario. So, and there it is included, of course, investment and operation. And that's why you are conducting an individual verification of financing needs when you are applying this methodology. Plus, in this case, you also have to apply the calculation of eligible costs plus maximum state aid intensity in order to cap the aid which can be granted to the project. But the essential thing, or the essential paragraph, is the one before, where you are conducting an individual verification of financing needs. Another example, Article 48 of the GBER, investment aid for energy infrastructure, which, well, I have written it there because it's something which also might not be clear. This covers electricity and gas transmission, infrastructure, and distribution mainly. And there, the maximum aid calculation follows this route. The eligible cost shall be the investment cost. The aid amount shall not exceed the difference between the eligible cost and the operating profit of the investment. Here again, you are taking into account the profit, the operating profit of the investment, so it is an individual verification of financing needs. And now the last point I wanted to deal with, which has been already discussed. Even the example I give is the one which Diana has come up with. I brought it because it's, in our experience, also the one where most questions come up with, but let's go from the beginning. The identification of the correct counterfactual. Now, a counterfactual, you will find several rules or several references to counterfactuals over the text of the energy and environmental aid guidelines. And I have tried to put them here together in order to have a clear overview of what is a counterfactual. Now, the definition itself is an alternative, technically comparable investment that the beneficiary would credibly realize without aid and which does not achieve the common interest objective or that only attains that objective to a lesser degree. Now, the common interest objective is obviously the increase in environmental protection. And it is also important to take into account that we are talking about an alternative project which wouldn't receive state aid. what the guidelines say also is that it has to be, it will be credible and genuine if it relates to the decision-making process prevalent at the time of the decision. So if you present some feasibility studies where it had been considered an alternative project, normally this will fulfill the condition of the counterfactual, of the correct counterfactual identification. So any documentary evidence, I have written it also, on alternative investment considered in the feasibility study should be sufficient. I have written is. Of course, it has to be correct in the feasibility study, should be sufficient in order to identify that alternative project as a correct counterfactual. Now, what are the conclusions from this? First of all, in principle, the project, the alternative project, should be profitable without aid. But of course, if there is some operating aid scheme which applies or would apply in any case, you can take into account that operating aid which already is existing in order to make the calculation and see whether indeed it is profitable. Second, it can be a theoretical situation, so it doesn't have to relate to the specific decision that the beneficiary or the alternative project, which in fact the beneficiary will do if he's not doing that project. As we have mentioned before, there are many examples where you would say, well, if I don't make this project, I won't make any project anyway. That's not sufficient. There are theoretical situations which have to be taken into account, and a theoretical situation can be a correct counterfactual to the project. And it can also, of course, be a do-nothing situation. This is quite exceptional, so you won't, it won't be easy to convince, I guess, the Commission that a do-nothing situation is the correct counterfactual. But, for instance, for energy efficiency project, if you go, this I took directly from the last guide to the GBER, which is also very useful. I advise you to read it carefully and thoroughly. There it is specifically mentions that for energy efficiency under certain conditions, a do-nothing situation can be the correct counterfactual. And then I have taken the example of a CHP plant, which we have discussed already before, so I will just mention this example. What would be the correct counterfactual? You are producing both heat and electricity. You go to the Annex 1 of the guidelines, where you, Annex 1 or 2? It's 2, I think, where you have the counterfactuals for the different scenarios, for the different projects, and they say the counterfactual to a CHP plant is a conventional electricity or heating production system with the same capacity in terms of effective production of energy. But of course, it's not the same to take a counterfactual as a counterfactual infrastructure for the production of heat or for the production of electricity. The cost will vary or can vary quite a lot, and obviously based on that you will calculate what is the aid that can be granted. So which should you choose? It will depend on the aim of the project. If the aim is heat production and electricity is only a byproduct, then you will take as a counterfactual a heat generation infrastructure with the same overall capacity like your project. You will take those costs, and the difference between the costs of the counterfactual and those of your project will be the ones eligible. If, on the opposite, the main aim of the project is the production of electricity, then of course it will be a conventional electricity generator which you will take as your counterfactual. So that's it from my side, and I think we will have the question and answer session after the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, maybe, as I said in the introduction this morning, it should also be an interactive workshop, and I want to stick to my promise. So maybe if there are some questions right now or if the table, we take them right now, and otherwise we could come back later on. Are there any questions or comments which somebody would like to make? Don't see anyone? Okay, then we move to the, sorry, there's one question, yeah, please.
I'm Andreas Kalinikos from Greece, Managing Authority for Competitiveness. I would like to have a clarification in what we said before, that start of work means before the first firm commitment to order equipment. That means that if we have a tendering procedure without an award, it is okay?
If you have a bidding procedure which hasn't finished, a public tender, I mean, it's already a bidding procedure, so it's quite a particular situation. But in my opinion, if you already when making the general conditions which should be fulfilled in the procedure by the bidders, if you include that state aid will be granted, obviously you can grant that state aid. Now, if you didn't include the possibility of receiving aid in the conditions of the bidding procedure, obviously the candidates won't expect to receive state aid. They will still make their bids. It seems that there wouldn't be an incentive effect to afterwards grant aid to that project. So it will depend if you already took into account that it will grant state aid or not.
May I give a clarification? I'm talking about the tendering procedure of a beneficiary who wants to materialize a project. So if the board of directors of the beneficiary has a condition that if the project does not take state aid, it won't go ahead. Then we have the tender and it can be cancelled at any stage. Is it okay with the incentive effect? If in parallel we have applied for the approval from DigiCom.
If there is a provision already that
Yes.
a state aid is necessary to carry out the project,
Yes.
then of course yes. If it's already in the bid which was presented, the provision of receiving state aid as a necessary condition, there is an incentive effect.
It's good teamwork with microphones. We have to coordinate here very well. But it works. Are there any other questions at this moment? Of course, better we can always answer them also after the next speakers. Good. And now, of course, we continue with our next speakers. You were given the opportunity when you registered for the conference to ask your questions beforehand and to see. We also did this deliberately in order to get more feeling of what were the main questions you were confronted with. Some of those questions will now be answered in the next session by my colleagues, Yvonne Simon and Moin Scherninger, who both work at DG Regio, on one hand our specialist in state aid and our specialist in energy. So, and they will go through the main questions which you have been asking.
I need this tool to move on.
That's fine, she's going to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, indeed, I will, in fact, ask a lot of questions, and our colleague Yvonne will help on the reply side. So, first of all, I have a very general question, and it's been touched upon already in the earlier presentations a little bit. I think that there are inconsistencies between state aid rules and cohesion policy rules. So there are some things which can get EU financing which are not allowed by the state aid rules, and there are other things which are allowed under state aid rules, but they are not included for cohesion policy. So how can this be?
Okay. This micro is on? Yeah? Okay. This is indeed a very fundamental and basic question, but it really appears and is raised very, very often. And to give an answer to this questions, it's really important to make clear that with cohesion policy rules and with state aid rules, we have two different objectives. In cohesion policy, the aim is to decide on what the union funding should be spent on. And this is negotiated in the council with member states, yeah? So there people sit together and decide on what the union money should be invested for, yeah? Whereas the state aid rules, they try to preserve a competition which is distorted to the least extent necessary. Yeah? So we have two different objectives. And these two different objectives lead to a situation where there is indeed not full consistency in the rules. Yeah? To say that, okay, we do not want to invest union money into this area does not necessarily mean that member states may not on their own decide, yes, I, member state, want to invest for a certain activity. And this can be done then in compliance with state aid rules. So on the one hand, it can indeed be the situation, yeah, that our cohesion policy rules do not allow the spending in a specific area. For instance, for large companies, we have lots of restrictions for large companies, but you member states may very well decide that you want to also to give support to large companies, and this is perfectly fine and can be done in line with state aid rules. And at the same time, it can also be that that state aid rules have, in some areas, have a strict approach, but for this, you need to keep in mind that not absolutely everything is state aid. And for those, it can also make sense, yeah, that cohesion policy allows spending in some areas, but there is a large part which will not qualify as state aid. So the answer to the question is, please be aware, we have two different sets of rules with different objectives, and it is not possible, and it's also not the aim to achieve full consistency in this areas. Of course, when discussing the policies, the targets, and everything, we of course want to make sure that financing which is allowed under cohesion policy rules has no complete blockage from the state aid side, and this is something we achieved. Yeah? So I'm afraid the answer to the question is indeed there is no full consistency, but it's also not the purpose to achieve full consistency, and what we achieved is that the cohesion policy funding is possible in line with state aid rules, and this was the target. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Then I have a bit more going into the details. It came up already in the overview presentations this morning, the notion of economic activity, and I understand that state aid rules allow a 100% financing of non-economic activities. Can this apply to financings in the field of energy, and how can I distinguish between economic and non-economic activities?
Okay. Yes, first of all, I would like to confirm that non-economic activities can get 100% financing in line with state aid rules. But, and now coming for a small point back to the first question, that you can get 100% financing in line with state aid rules does of course not mean that you can get 100% from union funds for it. Yeah, this will be a co-financing issue if you want to do this. So this is also an example of non-full coherence and non-full consistency, because for non-economic activities, state aid rules do not prevent you from giving 100% financing, but of course it doesn't mean that you can also get this 100% from the union funds. This is then a combination of the two types of funding. Now back to the question as such. Yes, non-economic activities are not prevented from receiving 100% financing on the basis of state aid rules. But then of course the question is, what is economic and what is non-economic? And for this definition, we have jurisprudence, which now is also repeated in the notion of aid notice, which is a very important document, and which I would like to invite you to put to your daily or to the manual, which you can where you can take a look in on a daily basis if you are dealing with state aid rules. So economic activities is offering goods or services on a market, and since the Leipzig-Halle judgment, we also know that the construction of infrastructure, which is economically exploited, also relates to an economic activity, and to those activities, state aid rules can apply. Now, looking at our sector we are dealing with today, the energy sector, as you will be fully aware, I'm sure most activities in this field are economic. Yeah? Economic activities are products, yeah, which are sold on a market, and therefore the vast majority of activities is an economic one. Now, to give you some exceptions or ideas where possibly certain exceptions can be present. This can be energy production for exclusively own use. Yeah? If there is, for instance, in photovoltaic appliances, absolutely no feed into the grids. Yeah? This can be an example of non-economic activity. Or possibly, but here I underlined the possibly, energy efficiency for private housing. Already, if you have a situation that the houses are rented, yeah, you will no longer be on the safe side concerning the economic activity, and also if these houses then again have something which they feed into grids or whatever, they escape again this safe area, yeah, and this is. This is a difficulty also in the setting of rules, because often you cannot be sure that you really address only non-undertakings, and therefore you will need to develop rules which can apply to both situations, which then basically means it needs to be state aid compliant. So the answer is yes, yeah, but unfortunately for our field here, in the field of energy, it is hardly practical because most of the activities qualify as economic.
Thanks a lot. So this is quite clear then, but how can I, in this case, avoid spillover of public funding for non-economic activities into economic activities?
Yeah, so for the few cases that you do have non-economic activities, you of course also need to make sure that the funding doesn't spread over to the economic activities. And for this, you have to separate accounts. And this is something which is not specific here to the energy field, but applies across the board for all activities and for the checks in state aid control. So you have to separate accounts. And this has to be a so-called functional separation, the rules on which are set out in the Transparency Directive. Yeah? So these are the rules for keeping separate accounts.
To make it a little bit more concrete then, with a concrete example. So we expect that our planned photovoltaic infrastructure for a public building will feed in only limited amounts of electricity into the general grids. Is this limited sale of electricity changing the character of the infrastructure from non-economic to economic, and can the ancillarity concept perhaps be applied?
Okay. So this feeding into the grids is an economic activity. This means that electricity is sold on the market. This as such is an economic activity. Now, can this then kind of pollute the activity of the whole installation of this photovoltaic installation? On this, we have also in the notion of aid notice now developed some rules on when this is not the case. And this is the so-called ancillarity concept. This ancillarity concept was first developed in the field of research and development, but the notion of aid notice now also makes clear that it can be applied in other fields, including the field of energy. Now, what are the criteria for ancillarity? It means that you have a big part, which is a non-economic activity, and a rather limited part, which is an economic activity. And this economic activity needs to be either directly related and necessary, or intrinsically linked to the non-economic activity. And for intrinsically linked, we have also some guidance. It means basically that the same inputs are used. Now, for photovoltaic appliances, the energy is produced in exactly the same way. Yeah, it is using the very same inputs, and therefore one can say this is intrinsically linked. Then the second condition is that it does not exceed 20% of the relevant annual capacity. So you have to see if the electricity you produce with this infrastructure, that what you sell on into the grids remains below 20%. And if this is the case, it can be considered as ancillary, which means that the full setting up of this thing remains outside the notion of aid, and therefore can receive financing up to 100%. Of course, then you have again to keep separate accounts, yeah, distinguishing between the economic and non-economic activities. So the answer to the question is yes, this ancillarity concept can be applied, and provided that the capacity remains below 20% of what is sold into the grid, yeah, it can receive up to 100% financing.
Thank you. Another question still in a related field. And so we are a municipality and we want to invest in solar panels on our city hall. And the electricity will be used for own consumption, but also large parts will be fed into the net. And we can get part of the necessary financing from the European Regional Development Fund. The other parts will come from our own resources. Are our own resources also state aid?
Okay. Now, before I turn to the answer slide, I would like to point you to the important piece in the description of this case. But large part will be fed into the net. So here you will not be fine with the ancillarity concept because we read it will be large parts. Yeah, understood that it's more than 20%. So you will not be able to solve this case with the ancillarity concept. Yeah. So this means that the public funding you get, and this can be ERDF, but also national public funding, will qualify as state aid in such a case. Now, the ERDF is clearly state aid because it's at the disposal of the member states, therefore it qualifies as state resources. Now, what is with the co-financing coming from the own resources of the municipality? And these are, since it's a municipality, it's part of the public administration, are also state aid, are also state resources. Since it's a municipality and not a public company, it's also imputable to the state. You may be aware, if you have already come across such cases, if it is public companies, there can be a question about imputability, whether or not the state decides on the use of the money, or if it's the public company on its own. This is not a question if you have a part which is part of the general administration, such as the municipality. Then we need to look for other criteria. And the criterion which DG Comp is applying in this situation is to see if the investment of the municipality is is reasonable in economic terms. So if the investment of the municipality, if for this investment it can be said that it is achieving a reasonable return on investment, it would be considered as own resources and therefore not qualifying on its own as another state aid. Yeah. This is the solution DG Comp has applied in cases, and so for this it is necessary to show then as municipality that your investment is reasonable in economic terms. In addition, of course, again, here it is also necessary to show with separate accounts that these resources are really coming from the municipality and not originating from other parts. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Then we're moving into a bit of a different type of question. Our planned infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is located in an assisted region. Instead of relying on the state aid provisions for energy, could we perhaps apply the state aid rules for regional aid, the regional aid guidelines?
This is no longer possible. As Maria Segura this morning also mentioned, before the RAC could apply to energy, the RAC no longer applies to energy, and the GBER excluded energy generation, distribution, and infrastructure from the scope of the regional aid section. So for these type of things, only the environmental and energy section of the GBER can be applied. But please note that under the GBER, energy efficiency support is not excluded from the application of the regional aid section of the GBER. So for these type of things, one could also still use the GBER. But the question, I go back to the slide, was about energy infrastructure. And for this energy infrastructure, the answer is no. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you. Then we have a couple of questions related to electricity grid. So we would like to finance an electricity grid. Can we apply Article 48 of the General Block Exemption Regulation, even though it says that electricity and gas storage projects are excluded?
In the Article 48 of the GBER, as Maud said, it reads, what is excluded from the application of this article is electricity and gas storage projects. And this already after the second week or so of the application of the GBER, we had the first question, does this mean we cannot apply the Article 48 to electricity? And DG Comp confirmed, no, this is not the case. It should be read electricity storage and gas storage. So this limitation of the Article 48 only applies to electricity storage, and gas storage and oil is also mentioned in this article, but not relevant here. These are the things which are excluded. So for grids, yeah, the Article 48 can be applied.
And this planned electricity grid, it's going over many kilometers. It's a long grid. Is it a single infrastructure project, even if several national administrative approvals are necessary for the whole distance? Is it still a single one?
So this is a thing which is also really relevant in practice. Yeah? There are projects which go over long distances, involve different elements for the construction, and then people wonder: do I have one project or do I have many projects in front of me? And this issue is of course relevant for the notification thresholds, yeah, and it's also relevant for the aid intensities. So this is something where people really need to pay attention and make some reflections in order to be sure: do I have one project in front of me or a bunch of projects? Now, what is an energy infrastructure for the purposes of state aid control here is defined in Article 130. but there are no criteria for determining whether it's now a single project or not. Yeah, so you need to make sure, okay, do I have an energy infrastructure to which I now want to apply my rules, but it doesn't tell you yet if it's a single project or several energy infrastructure projects. This is in fact left to you, to the national authorities, but there are some criteria. And the starting point, of course, should be the project description. Do I have the same beneficiary for the whole project, or are there several beneficiaries? Is it the same content, the same timing? Of course, I admit same content is something which is also open to judgment, yeah? But another, or which can also help for the same content question is the one on the economic logic. And does this project make sense only as one project, or would also separate parts make projects? These are criteria on which you should make up your mind and make a case if you want to consider this as one project or as several projects. I believe there is indeed some judgment involved. Yeah, there is not. It's also, since we in defining these type of rules can of course not cover the whole life, yeah, which and the variety of life which can exist in such abstract text. So there will necessarily be some judgment, but these are the criteria on the basis of which you should be guided and on which you should make up your mind to determine this.
And we also want to calculate the permissible aid amount for financing the electricity grid. How much can be given to it under Article 48 of the GBER?
This is, now we are entering to tricky fields. Yeah? The 48 is the one for the energy infrastructure. You have, of course, first to see what are the eligible costs. The eligible costs are the investment cost. Now, for the maximum aid amount, there is a type of gap assessment foreseen. So it's the difference of the eligible cost and the operating profit. Yeah? For the operating profit, you find again a definition in the GBER. It's the difference between the discounted revenues and the discounted operating costs, where the difference is positive, yeah, because there it's it's because of the perspective. And then the operating costs, there you have a longer list than what was able to put on this slide. It includes material, personnel, but not depreciation cost and not financing cost. And with these credentials, yeah, you need to make the calculation. And then for the deduction, you have two possibilities. Either you do an ex ante estimation of what the result is, and you deduct it, or you foresee a clawback mechanism, which then at a later stage reduces possibly the amount of support. So these are the credentials which are set out in Article 48, plus the definitions which you can find in the block exemption, and this is then the calculation you need to make, and it's a type of gap assessment.
I move to a question in the area of renewable energy, and this also touches a bit on what has been discussed already earlier. So for renewable energy investments, the GBER says that eligible costs are the extra investment costs, as we have already seen. What does this mean when our options are either the planned renewable energy facility, or no investment, or investments in non-renewables with the same capacity, or a facility with half the capacity of the first option?
Yeah, so this question is really going to something which was already discussed this morning, and also the Netherlands raised this question. It's something which is tricky, which is prone to
only me. Now you're...
Somebody who can help? Otherwise you can come and sit here. Yeah? Then, no, Denise is going to look there, but go, continue like this.
Okay, so I think we discussed this point already this morning, and it is clear that this is indeed a tricky part of the application of the rule. It's also to some extent, or normally in the block exemption, you try to have clear, easily applied rules, yeah. And this is of course an area where someone can have questions. Now, as it was already clear in the lawmaking phase, yeah, DGCOM included this Annex 2 to the energy and environmental aid guidelines with a list of typical counterfactuals. Now, some emphasis is also on the word typical, yeah, as was made clear this morning. But if you, as authorities, want to play it safe and be on the safe side, I think you can take then the example which is listed in this table. And for electricity production, it's the cost of a conventional power plant with the same capacity. Yeah, so in this list here, this is then the number 3 of the alternative. Since it's typical, yeah, it's not ruled out that you can also build a case with something else. But I think in such a situation you should consider taking advice from, and you can use technical assistance budget. Yeah, so you may then try to get some additional expert advice on this point, or you can of course also get in touch with DGCOM or DG Regio to get further advice on this point. But in order to play it safe, if you take something from the annex, this should then be fine. Also, if auditors come up and see you and raise the question, what was taken as extra investment.
Thank you. I also have a question related to energy efficiency in buildings, where most of the European structural and investment funds will actually be invested in the new period in this area. And in this case, this particular case, we will want to give loans for energy efficiency renovations in large apartment buildings. What are the main options that we have to achieve state aid compliance for this?
This is also a type of question which reaches us in Regio actually very often. Yeah, that member states come and ask us basically to design their projects. Yeah, and this is not strictly our role. Yeah, you are the member state. Yeah, you want to decide on the use of the money. We cannot impose on you the exact way on how you want to spend it. Yeah, and this is something. This is a type of freedom. Yeah, and make use of it. Yeah, so it's there are several ways on achieving state aid compliance of such a project. Yeah, and we as DG Regio, but also as DG Com, the aim is not to impose a specific way on it. Yeah, now what options you have depend on several considerations. So the first one is there state aid. So you will need to check at the level of the potential beneficiaries. Yeah, the final ones, the entities handing out the loans. Yeah, the fund managers, potential other investors. Could there be possibly state aid? And you have different ways to construct it. For instance, if you choose to tender out who should be the fund manager, yeah, you can avoid state aid at that level. Yeah, so there are lots of options for which you have flexibility and where you are in the driving seat to decide how your project should look like. Yeah? But these are the considerations you need to take. You can also use so-called off-the-shelf instruments, because precisely for these type of things take something off the shelf, yeah, and you will be sure it is state aid compliant. If you feel, okay, no, it doesn't fit to my needs, it's not exactly what I want to do, yeah, this is also fine, and there you can then go to the next level and see what are the possibilities in the GBER, yeah, and the GBER has the Article 39, which is now really specifically also adapted to these energy efficiency in housing. But you can also use the Article 38, and as I mentioned, since energy efficiency is not excluded from in the GBER for the regional aid part, you can even use the regional aid section of the GBER. And this offers you really a variety of possible constructions for this project. And if all of it does not fit, you could even still go and notify. Yeah? So for these type of things, I go back to this to the question. Yeah, you need you need in the first instance make up your mind. What are the essentials of my project? What do I really want? Yeah, and starting from there, it is then possible to look for the most appropriate way to achieve stated compliance. And as I said, it's really a variety, and we as Commission should not take away your freedom in making these choices.
But at the same time, or generally, I really need legal certainty for my project. Could you please tell me how I should set it up, how I should draft my support system to really have it compliant with state aid rules?
Yeah. So this is really what I also explained for the question before of flexibility. Yeah? And we want to enable you, yeah, and to understand the rules which exist on the state aid side and the possibilities that are over there. But it remains your choice. Yeah? From shared management to direct management, if we were to tell you how exactly it needs to be done. Yeah? And it's clear that there are some areas where uncertainty, we discussed the extra cost. Yeah? There are other areas where it is not possible to have such detailed rules which cover all the varieties in life, and therefore there will remain some uncertainties. But to limit these uncertainties, we have offers like this off-the-shelf instruments, but you can also limit the uncertainties in for instance, in using your technical assistance budget and get additional advice, yeah, on these questions which you should then put in your file. Yeah, and if you just come and look at it, yeah, you have a very good point, yeah, that you have then make reflections on this point, and if there is a remainder which can be decided in two ways, yeah, I think it would be very difficult, yeah, to make a case against you if you have really on the file evidence that you reflected on this point and found a solution which is reasonable. Now, there are of course also possibilities to go to reform. Now we can also channel it to us. Of course, the final word on this reform. Yeah. So this is also a possibility which of course remains open to you, but you should also develop your own municipal capacity in the field, and this is one of our goals today. Yeah, is the ability to apply it.
But another specific question would say about the interpretation of state aid rules. Where can I get some guidance?
There we have also some channels, yeah, which are available to you. And most importantly, I would like to advertise a little bit the e-state aid wiki, yeah, which is a very useful tool where administrations can submit interpretation questions about state aid rules, and which is made available to all who have free access to this facility. The number of administrations
Thank you, Morten. Thank you for going through the questions which some of you have asked, and I hope that you recognize your questions. I hope that they, and even better, I hope that they also were sufficiently well answered, but there's still opportunity to ask further questions. Before we break up for lunch and I give you some further instructions what we're going to do this afternoon, I still would like to give the opportunity to you to ask questions to our three speakers for this morning session. Are there any questions? I see. Yeah, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Hromada from Czech Republic. I have a question regarding slide 11 from the previous presentation, where you said that under some terms the own resources of the municipality, when the municipality is the beneficiary, might be considered as state resources as well. So the co-financing made by the municipality should also be regarded as state aid in some cases. Does it mean that, for example, when there is some, because this interpretation has a huge impact not only in the field of energy but all fields of infrastructure projects. So, for example, where there is some sporting hall, where the municipality is the owner, does it mean that the municipality is the grantor of state aid to itself? Because it's really confusing, and in these cases, how the aid intensity should be fulfilled. Thank you.
The municipality as such is a public administration, yeah? And since for the term state resources, you take all levels within a member state that belong to the state can have the possession then of state resources. So the point on state resources is fulfilled, yeah? The question
comes with a scheme that is applied, and that is no state aid when it comes to private owners that live in their houses, but at the moment, I mean, the house is rented, I mean, you have an economic activity. So in order to fulfill all these requirements, it's much better if the schemes that are designed, especially for energy efficiency in buildings, really try to mirror the GBER provisions. GBER provisions gives a variety, gives have a space, I mean, to put a lot of measures between, under that. So, but we can discuss also these issues, I mean, during the groups.
Thank you. I could see there was a follow-up question from the Czech colleague. Was it? Did I see correctly?
Just wanted to continue on that problem. So you mean that this own contribution of the municipality should make a return on that investment on this activity. But what if this is some loss-making infrastructure, for example, some cultural house, not generating enough return on investment, but still it is something which the municipality owns and operates by itself.
Sure, I would like to add a few things. This discussion was really in the context of state aid for renewable, well, it was solar panels in the questions. And there we really expect that with the aid, within the normal limits, a renewable producer will be able to really participate in the market and get a fair return on the investment. Now, if we move to culture, it's a bit different. And there I would really suggest that you check the notice on notion of the aid, because there the Commission really tried to explain the culture sector more in detail, and there are many other options where you do not have an economic activity. So for the culture sector, quite often for the smaller parts, the aid is excluded anyway, not only for the own contribution, but in general it's not considered economic activity. So there are other options to be seen, to be checked.
Thank you. Again, Marcin Janiak, Polish Minister of Energy. I have a question concerning regarding discount rate using any purpose of calculation of funding gap. Delegated regulation for 80 gives opportunity, Article 19 gives opportunity to use different discount rate than 4%. And my question is, because sometimes it might be seen as too low, especially when we are talking about renewables or high efficient cogeneration, and beneficiary might be not interested in implementation of such a project. And my question is, who may approve change using different discount rates? Should it be national managing authority, or should it be a European Commission? And this is my first question, and if I can, I would ask a second question concerning eligibility of preparation works, because some preparation works are possible to have such a preparation works before submission of application form, and does such a cost might be eligible or not? That has been made before submission of application form. Thank you.
I think on our side, on the cohesion policy side, the 4% is a proxy. We are applying for simplification purposes. Yeah. I'm afraid there is no strict, or there is no kind of full certainty in using the 4% on the cohesion policy side that it would be the same under the state side. Now, since, on the cohesion policy side, we did not take the 4% completely out of the room, of course, yeah, so it should be a proxy. Yeah, therefore, I think one can make a case that that the 4% can be appropriate, but I'm afraid the state aid side doesn't necessarily take these 4% in the same way. Yeah, so for discounting it, yeah, you should take what is appropriate for the in economic purposes. Now the second part, the eligibility of the cost for the preparatory studies. Normally, and I think this was also covered by the colleague from Jaspers, normally these costs are not eligible under the different GBER provisions. However, you will also find specific GBER provisions which allow for preparatory studies. Yeah? And this is also the case in the field of energy. So for this, to cover the cost for this, you have a specific provision. But under other GBER provisions, costs which are not taking place before the start of works are normally also not eligible. But again, I would like to ask Tom to share if there's some feedback or to say something different.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have much to add. Indeed, we don't have anything with the 4%. We received also questions, and yeah, it's not really clear where it is come from. Normally, we don't have any strict rules. We have just one limitation for a reasonable rate of return for operating it from renewables for small installations. But otherwise, in terms of discount rates, we have not really developed anything that would be limiting. Normally, we would assume that, yeah, the appropriate discount rate will be chosen somehow related to cost of capital. Of course, if it's 4% or if it's lower, if it's limited to a lower level, it makes things even easier. But yeah, and for preparatory works, it's difficult to say because it can cover such a wide range of whatever operations.
Well, besides that indeed there is a specific provision covering certain preparatory works within the GBER. Should also take into account that normally the eligibility of costs in these projects have to be related to the counterfactual. So on top of that, in any case, you would have to show that those preparatory works would not apply to the counterfactual. So it's quite unlikely in any case that they would be eligible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Stéphane Dupuis from the French, you can't hear me. I'm Stéphane Dupuis from the French Permanent Representation. Do you hear me? Yeah? More or less. Try to speak loud. Yeah, my question also refers to slide 11 on solar panels. More or less, we're talking about very small municipalities, in fact, trying to develop solar panels as a way to implement new sources of energy on a very local, perimeter. So as we saw, in fact, in the new communication of the notion of aid, and we thought that those developments on purely local infrastructures were very helpful, even if indeed there are resources from the state concerned in those kinds of investments. Could it be also assessed that in some cases we're talking about purely local infrastructures and then consider that there is no state aid because there is no impact on trade and on competition? Thanks.
One last question, Mr. Foch. Oh?
Okay, sorry, just to add on that. For local infrastructure, it can be discussed if there is effect on trade or not. But if we talk about solar panels, it's quite difficult to see them as purely infrastructure because they are generating electricity. And once this electricity is in the grid, the electricity flows and it's traded between member states. So it becomes really extremely difficult in this specific situation to see it as no effect on trade.
Just one last question in line with the question of discount rate. Do you have to take in account the discount rate for the project or for the shareholders? I mean, do you have to take the IRR of the project or the shareholders' rate of return expected, which is somehow higher? The shareholders' return rate, which is higher. In terms of an electricity project, generally speaking, the shareholders expect 10, 12, 11, 12 return. And at the size of the project with debt financing, the project has an IRR of 7 to 8%. So what is the discount rate you have to take in account? Because if you take the shareholders' discount rate, you get a larger eligible cost.
Yes, perhaps I will take this question. Normally, we rely on the weighted average cost of the capital. So it's really the discount rate for the project, not for the shareholders. And what we see is indeed that for the shareholders, that's the highest rate that you can have. And then for debts is a lower rate. And when you take the average for the project is it's lower than for the shareholders. But I mean, the project is the one who gets that gets the financing, so it makes sense to look at the level of the project, what happens.
I hope that was a clear answer. Pleased to meet some very clear. So thank you very much for your questions this morning's session, and thanks again to Yvonne, Mort, and Pedro for their presentations. And we will move now into the lunch break, and I will explain you already a little bit how it's going to work after the lunch break. After the lunch break, you really have to roll up your sleeves, and we're going to work on 3 case studies. So the work will be also on your side to ask the questions, to come up with the comments. There will be 3 workshops, and they will be repeated. So there will be 2 sessions of 3 workshops, so you can participate in maximum 2 different workshops. One will be on renewables, one on energy efficiency, and one on energy infrastructure. The one on energy efficiency will take place here, and the 2 other ones will be taking place on the first floor, but it will be indicated by our organizers where to go to. And you can see from the list for which workshops you have registered. The workshops will be led by our 3 colleagues from DG Competition, you saw who gave the presentation this morning, and then 3 colleagues from DG Regio and Pedro from Jaspers will be the rapporteurs giving feedback after the sessions in the workshops and the case studies. So we start at 1:30 for the first case studies, and then at 2:30 for the second round of case studies. And until then, there will be the lunch served, and that will also be indicated when you go out of the room where the lunch will be served. So once again, I invite you to participate actively in these workshops, ask your questions. We will not maybe always be able to give you all the clear answers, but I think it's really an opportunity to discuss on the basis of 3 concrete cases how to deal with state aid in the energy sector. So thank you for the moment, and see you back later on in the afternoon. I would like to give feedback of the 3 workshops, what was discussed in a very concise way, what were the main topics, so we don't have to repeat the whole workshop as such, but really the main topics and the main lessons which can be drawn from each workshop. And I would like to start with the first workshop, which was on renewables, and my colleague Camille Dörfler from DG Regio will give the main highlights. Camille?
All right, good afternoon. I hope you'll manage 15 more minutes. I am not a professional, neither in energy nor in state aid. This is a test whether I have got it right. I will not present again the project itself. 2/3 of you were sitting in our room. It was about offshore wind farm, a small project generating 20 megawatts. And I will not go into details about the cost and financing. Our task was to define whether the primary question was whether this case is a case for state aid. And therefore we went through the assessment of existence of state aid. We were discussing whether it matters, whether the beneficiary is private or not. We concluded that it's really not the case. What matters is the economic activity. We were discussing what is important is the connection and connectivity to the grid, and whether there is economic advantage. We concluded there with this with the grant support, possible grant support, that it's likely to be the case. We concluded that there is a selectivity. We said that given that there's a grant, this is likely to be state aid, and even if there was a loan, there would need to be a calculation using reference market condition, and because that would be rare to support such a scheme from public funds, that it's likely that this would be the aid. And we also assess the public funds. It's clear with the public national public funding In case of the funds, in our case, it was ERDF. If it was managed by the managing authority, then it would be considered as state aid. Also, this part, the exception would be if it was some other commission funding, NR 300 or, for example, the under Juncker plan. And we concluded that this was the case for state aid. The second questions we were supposed to ask whether which rules to apply. So one option was GBER, which we excluded because of the threshold, and therefore we had to use the guidelines, which were, however, quite similar. And further on, we went into quite details on assessing the common interest and necessity, the incentive effect, and also the counterfactual analysis through which we were able to define the maximum aid amount. I think I must thank you both to Diana and also to many of you who actively participated and basically made this happen and gave me the opportunity to learn how this assessment should be done.
Thank you, Camille. Diana, you will still like to add something, or that was a good summary of the workshop? Thank you. Thank you. Then we go to the second workshop, which was here in this room, which was on energy efficiency, and where Pedro and Christos were the hosts and were the trainers, if I can put it like that. So Pedro, you want to give us the main feedback?
Yes. Thank you. You were attending, I think, the first session, so you have seen a bit the discussion, and basically the case referred to 3 different schemes for energy efficiency on public buildings and then on residential buildings, multi-apartment buildings, single-family houses. And, well, we discussed based on some guidance questions, and the first issue was, of course, as it's the case for all state aid case, to identify whether the project involves state aid or not. There we had to go through, differentiate clearly between the public buildings and the residential buildings. Public buildings, we also made clear that the fact that it's public doesn't mean that there cannot be state aid. It's a functional definition, the concept of undertaking, so public bodies can constitute undertakings. But we also saw that indeed there can be public buildings where no economic activity is carried out, so that has no state aid implications when we finance an energy efficiency intervention in those buildings. We also saw, again, the concept of ancillary economic activity, which for this purpose is very useful because, of course, it is difficult to rule out completely the existence of any economic activity in a building. And we then passed over to the second type of intervention, which is in residential buildings, which we saw is or can become much more complex. We saw the nuances between, well, what is an economic activity within a residential building. The mere fact of renting out an apartment would constitute an economic activity. The owner would, in that case, be an undertaking. So we also discussed about the possibility of ruling out the existence of distortion of competition and trade. In those cases, we saw that it's very difficult to argue on that. And basically then we moved over to discussing about the compatibility of such a scheme with the internal market. We discussed about the possibility of applying the de minimis regulation. We were not very convinced about that being the best option, so we decided probably the GBER makes more sense in this case. We discussed about the counterfactual for energy efficiency in buildings, which in many cases can be considered as a do-nothing option, which is quite exceptional, as we have seen for a counterfactual. And yeah, and then we saw the whole process, what was the specific article which would apply in this case, since it was grants and not financial instruments. It would be Article 38 of the GBER. So basically that was the points of discussion. The conclusion was for public buildings, probably it would make sense to try to go for a non-state aid case. For residential buildings, probably you would build up a scheme under the GBER.
Good. Thank you, Pedro. Christos, you would like to add something?
As Pedro pointed out, I mean that putting the scheme under GBER, I mean, gives, I mean, to the aid recipients a certainty, I mean, that under any circumstances, if they do an economic activity or a non-economic activity, this will be state aid compliant. So it gives a certainty, and it allows the member states, I mean, to have a tool where with which they can easily go on energy efficiency interventions measures for in the building sector.
Thank you. Thank you. That was workshop number 2. And in workshop number 3, you discussed a case study in the area of energy infrastructure, Yvonne and Zora. Maybe you can present, Yvonne? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we had a little case in which a company wanted to upgrade a medium voltage electricity grid to become a smart grid for distribution of renewable energy. And we set out a little bit on how the financing is planned, that we have some contribution from the structural funds, that we have resources, public resources of the member state and own resources of the company. And then we went through to assess this case on the notion of aid. We looked at the different type of resources, we looked at the different players, and concluded that for company C, the ERDF and the public resources of the member state will qualify as state aid. And since in our case, company C is a private company, in that scenario, the 10 million which were contributed from that company do not count for the purposes of amount of aid. And if it was a public company, it would have been assessed whether the resources are imputable. So we concluded that we have a state aid in front of us and looked for possible block exemptions. And then we found the Article 48 in the block exemption regulation and went through the different criteria which apply there. And a first point was, of course, to see if this upgrade of the electricity grid is taking place in an assisted region. And this was not specified in our case description, and so this is a point which definitely needs to be clarified. And we can apply the block exemption only in case that it's taking place in an assisted region. Then we also looked at the exception which is foreseen in Article 48 of the block exemption, that it should only apply to electricity, gas storage, or does not apply to electricity, gas storage and oil infrastructures. And we clarified that for electricity it's supposed to exclude electricity storage, but not electricity as a whole, and therefore our upgrade of the grids can be covered under the Article 48. And then we had a detailed discussion on how to calculate the permissible aid amount under this provision. We deducted from the total cost the operating profits. And how to calculate this in line with the rules and also what is in the definition of the block exemption. And then we also looked at the two possibilities: clawback mechanism or ex ante assessment, and specified the possibilities which exist there. And finally, we discussed what happens if the whole case is not taking place in an assisted region, and if therefore a notification is necessary, and to assess a little bit the prospects of such a case of being cleared after a notification. And there we concluded that despite the fact that it's not included in the GBER, the prospects in principle are very good to have it cleared after a notification. Yeah, so this is it.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne, for your summary. Zora, you're in the back, if you still want to add something.
Did it beautifully.
Good, good, thank you. That's a sign of good cooperation. Thanks a lot. So thank you, all 6 of you, for chairing the 6 workshops. And I would like to offer the last opportunity to participants in the room. If you still would have any questions you would like to ask to one of the panelists or some comments you would like to make before I wrap up for the seminar. And I don't see very quickly anyone who would like to make a comment. Then I hope everything was clear. I think it was as clear as possible. We could get it in one day. I think there's still a lot of room for further discussion on this topic. But then I would like to conclude this seminar. So before I thank once more our six panelists for leading the workshops. Thanks a lot. So you have been today, you were invited for a workshop on state aid in the energy sector, but then from the perspective from managing the European structural and investment funds. So the major part of you are working in this area and are working in managing authorities or intermediate bodies. So that was the perspective from which we have organized this workshop, and that's why it's also organized by us in DG Regio in cooperation, of course, with DG Competition. There's nothing like a free lunch. Of course, you were invited to learn from this today, but we also expect something from you. And what we expect from you is that you share your knowledge and your information, what you've learned here today, back home with your colleagues in your own country, because we think it's important to spread this knowledge as well. We had the rule of this seminar was to have a limited number of representatives per member state to allow the discussion and to have the interaction. But also we think it's very important that you as a kind of ambassadors or train the trainers, whatever you want to call it, to bring back this knowledge home and share this knowledge with your colleagues. Besides that, we have been organizing this seminar from the background of strengthening administrative capacity in the area of state aid. And I think it was in Yvonne's presentation this morning, she gave already an indication what kind of tools exist already. And we would like to encourage you to use these tools to the maximum, which are available in your program. So in your operational programs, you have technical assistance available. Use this if you think it might be useful for example, for counterfactual assessments, for further trainings on state aid. This money is there for using it for this purpose. And state aid is one of the main policies which has a huge impact on cohesion policy. So it's also very justified to use the money for that purpose. For the rest, if you have any, we've been trying to answer as many questions today as possible you have been raising. But of course, there will always be new questions coming up, and also on the basis of the case studies which were discussed, it's not always black-white, the answers. So we can clearly understand that once in a while you would need some further expertise or feedback from experts. There is this network set up by DG Competition of contact points, where there's a contact point in each member state. So we encourage you very much to use this network for raising your questions. And in most of the cases, these contact points will be able to answer your questions. And only for the more complicated cases, they will be forwarded to the colleagues here in Brussels. So I think it's a very good network where a lot of know-how is concentrated and to use it for this purpose. And in the same area, also the State Aid Wiki, the knowledge management tool, is an important tool where probably already a lot of the answers can be found for your questions. From our perspective, again, from the perspective from DG Regio, DG Regional Policy, I just would like to mention also 2 other tools which we could use also for spreading the knowledge. We have set up a tool which is called peer-to-peer, which is running now for 1 year, under which we can support exchange between cohesion policy practitioners, also in the area of state aid, for study visits, for expert visits, or also for small-scale workshops. And we have now organized more than 50 of those events, and state aid is clearly one of the topics which is in demand. To give an example, to make it clear, for example, an expert from Slovenia went to Croatia to explain to the Croatians how they use in Slovenia the state aid rules in the transport sector. So it can be very much hands-on practical for a 2-day exchange or 3-day exchange where a lot of information can be exchanged. And now we are here with a group of practitioners, people with a similar background, similar working area. So we think it might also be interesting to see how we can further develop a kind of a network, not necessarily with all the people around here, but with there's a kind of a basis of practitioners in state aid in the area of cohesion policy, and how we can develop also further a community of practitioners in this specific area. So we will see also how we can further develop on the knowledge and the expertise which is gathered in this room. So that's all as a background why we have been organizing these seminars and from the perspective of administrative capacity building. As already mentioned this morning, this is not a standalone initiative. We are organizing more seminars. We have been organizing a few seminars and a few more are coming up. And the next one will be on the 22nd of September and will be about regional aid and SMEs. And the setup will be again similar as today, explaining the rules of the game, answering the questions you have sent to us in advance, and then also discussing on the basis of 3 concrete case studies. Besides that, we will also organize in autumn a new training with the European Institute of Public Administration, IPA, where we have already organized a few modules, and the next module will be about state aid. That's a training which normally lasts 2 days, which will be given in DG Regio, and where it's a bit more, I would say it's a bit more broader than what we discussed today. It's more explaining the general rules of state aid, explaining the modernization of the state aid package, GBER rules, the different guidelines that exist, but it will be a 2-day training, and where you or your colleagues, where you think it might be interesting for them, they are most welcome to participate. It will be for free, and it will be given in here in DG Regio in Brussels. And the date has not been fixed yet, but these dates will be announced on our website, InfoRegio. This training, like all the other trainings, all the material you have seen today will be published on our website on InfoRegio as well. So on the dedicated website for training under the State Aid Action Plan. And there will also be a transcript of this seminar will be written. So there will be a short summary, which you can, again, which we encourage you to share with your colleagues who work in the same area back home. As always, we will also evaluate every seminar, so you will receive from the organizers an evaluation form. And for us, it will be really interesting to get your honest and constructive feedback. Tell us honestly what you liked, what you didn't like. Were the case studies concrete enough? Were they not in line with your practice? Do you need more hands-on information, or do you need more in-depth information? All this kind of feedback is for us relevant because we're trying to see if this was the right format or setup, and where we can adapt it to your needs. We're happy to do this. So you will receive this evaluation form as soon as possible after this event. Then I would like to thank, of course, a few people, a few colleagues, especially the colleagues from DG Competition for participating with us in this event, the colleagues from Jaspers for giving their expertise, my own colleagues in DG Regional Policy, and also Maria for her expertise, for explaining the challenges in this area this morning. And also the colleagues from Applica, who have been organizing all the logistics around this event, who have been, and sent also the invitations. That is everything I wanted to say. So I would like, oh yeah, sorry, one last point. If you would like to hand in back your badges again for environmental purposes, the organizers asked this, so please give back your badges. And on that last point, I would like to thank everybody for your active participation, for your comments, for your questions. I hope you liked it and it was useful for you. And please let us know, as I said before, in the feedback evaluation. And on that point, I would like to wish you a very safe home trip back home. Thank you very much.